There is something almost indecent about applying the word strong to a Primarch. Strong is a word for athletes, for warriors, for men who bend iron bars for applause and earn songs sung around fires. It fits inside a human mouth without straining. But the Primarchs, the 20 sons of the Emperor of Mankind, the demigods who led the Great Crusade and then tore the galaxy apart during the Horus Heresy, they do not belong anywhere near ordinary language. They exist at the bleeding edge of description, the place where comparison collapses and mythology begins. Every source that has ever tried to put a concrete scale on their capabilities ends up reaching for storm imagery, geological metaphors, comparisons to ancient gods. And the sources are right to do it, because these are beings designed to be beyond the measurable. And yet, people ask, they have always asked, just how strong are they, really? Not in some vague sense, not just a shrug and a very powerful. What can they actually do? What have they actually done, specifically, in the lore? How does that stack up against everything else the universe has thrown at the question? That is exactly what we are exploring today. This is a thorough, slow, complete walk through one of Warhammer's most enduring debates, covering the physical scale of these beings, the psychic dimensions of their power, the specific documented feats that appear across decades of Black Library novels and Games Workshop sourcebooks, how they compare against each other, and what the answer to this question looks like when you factor in their roles in the current 41st Millennium storyline. Every Primarch gets their moment. Every dimension of what strength means for these beings gets examined. And by the end, you are going to have a genuinely comprehensive answer to a question the Warhammer community has been arguing about for decades. Let's get into it. Section 1. What they are and why ordinary language fails them. Before we can talk about how strong the Primarchs are, we need to genuinely understand what they are. Because the word strong means something entirely different applied to a Primarch than it does applied to a Space Marine, and it means something different still when you apply it to the Emperor of Mankind. There is a hierarchy of power in the 41st Millennium, and the Primarchs sit at a very specific, very extraordinary point in that hierarchy. The Emperor created them. That sentence sounds simple. It absolutely is not. The Emperor of Mankind is a being who spent tens of thousands of years accumulating power across countless lifetimes. He walked through ancient human history as shaman, warlord, prophet, and hidden architect of civilization's survival. By the time he emerged from hiding to conquer Terra during the Unification Wars, he had already spent more time alive than most human civilizations have existed. When he turned his attention to creating children, true children, weapons and generals and heirs in the most literal possible sense, he did not simply engineer better soldiers. He did something no amount of pure science could replicate. He went to Molech. The lore of Molech is contested and debated, but the core revelation across multiple Black Library sources is consistent. The Emperor made a bargain at that world, a planet with an ancient doorway into the warp, an access point directly into the dimension of chaos. He either bargained with the ruinous powers directly, or he plundered their domain entirely, acquiring something, some deep fundamental power, that he then used to imbue his created sons with capabilities that genetic engineering alone could never have produced. This is confirmed across multiple Horus Heresy novels. The Chaos Gods themselves have knowledge of this exchange. It is one of the underlying reasons why every single Primarch, even the most loyal and steadfast, carries within them a seed of corruption that the gods of chaos can theoretically reach. The warp energy that makes them superhuman also creates a pathway through which the ruinous powers can eventually reach. The Primarchs are not simply very large, very strong transhumans. They are biological masterworks, enhanced by forces beyond normal science. They are the intersection of the finest human genetic material ever assembled, the accumulated scientific knowledge of a being who had spent 10 millennia refining his understanding of genetics and biology and the warp, and the raw, unfocused energy of a dimension that exists outside physical reality and runs on intent and emotion and pure potential. Every Primarch carries within their flesh and their soul a fragment of something that does not have a comfortable name. They are demigods in the fullest possible sense of that word, simultaneously mortal and radically more than mortal. When their 20 gestation pods were stolen by the Chaos Gods and flung through the warp to scattered worlds across the galaxy before the suns inside them were even born, an act of deliberate sabotage against the Emperor's plans, those infants landed on those worlds and immediately began reshaping their environments, not slowly, not over decades of patient growth. Immediately, Vulkan landed on Nocturne, a volcanic death world of lethal predators and extreme conditions, and by the age of 3 standard Terran years was already larger and stronger than every adult male on the planet. He was not trained into that condition. He was not exercised into it. He simply was, already, more than everything around him, the way a seed contains the tree. Robert Guillemot landed on Macragge, a comparatively stable civilized world, and by the age of 10 had mastered every field of philosophy, science, mathematics, history, governance, and military strategy that the planet's accumulated knowledge contained. Not sampled, not shown aptitude for, mastered. He then rebuilt an entire planet's governance structure, suppressed a long-standing rebellion, established interplanetary trade with nearby systems, and developed a military capacity that impressed the Emperor himself when he finally arrived to claim his son. Leman Russ landed on Fenris, one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy, was taken in by a pack of Fenrisian wolves, enormous pack predators that made ordinary wolves look domestic and became more dangerous than they were within months. The wolves didn't civilize Russ. Russ lived among them until the humans of the Russ tribe found him, recognized that this was not a boy who had been raised by wolves, but something that could not be categorized, and brought him before their king. Ferrus Manus landed on Medusa and almost immediately threw himself into an active lava flow to wrestle the great silver worm Asurnoth, a warp-touched creature, immune to ordinary weapons, an apex predator in a landscape of apex predators, and held it under the molten rock until its metallic essence merged permanently with his own flesh and became the famous Silver Hands. He was an infant. He survived immersion in active magma and came out with new hands. These are not exceptional childhood moments. These are baseline. This is what all 20 of them did, each in their own way, on their own worlds. The power was always already in them. The worlds they landed on shaped their personalities and their cultures and the specific flavors of their extraordinary capabilities. But the power itself came from the Emperor and from the warp. It was woven into their cells before they ever drew their first breaths. Now a Space Marine. A standard Astartes warrior sits roughly 7 to 8 feet tall, depending on the author and the era of the lore, though Games Workshop has never established an absolutely binding canonical measurement. Their skeleton is reinforced with ceramic polymer compounds that make their bones functionally more durable than metal. They have 2 hearts, either of which can sustain full circulation independently. They have a secondary eyelid that filters extreme light. They can echolocate. They have an enhanced immune system that handles toxins and diseases that would kill an unmodified human in seconds. They have a biological process called the homophagia that allows them to absorb the memories of organic material they consume. They can survive in vacuum for limited periods. They can go weeks without sleep. Their blood-clotting mechanisms seal wounds that would cause fatal blood loss in unaugmented humans within moments. A Space Marine is the product of 19 separate genetic implants that rebuild a human body from the inside out over years of transformation, combined with years of mental conditioning, psychological preparation, and training regimens that push the human body to breaking point and beyond. They are the finest soldiers the human species can produce through technological means, deployed when ordinary military force is simply insufficient. And a Primarch is to a Space Marine what a Space Marine is to an ordinary human being. That ratio is the most important single piece of information in this conversation. The relationship between an ordinary human and a Space Marine is the same relationship a Space Marine has to his genetic father. Which means when you are calculating what a Primarch can do physically, you need to take the already impossible Space Marine baseline and apply that multiplier again in every direction simultaneously. Space Marines fight wars that would consume conventional armies. Primarchs fight wars that Space Marines write legends about, and they do it personally, in the thick of the fighting, because that is what they were made for. There is one more foundational element that needs to be established before we go anywhere else. Every single Primarch has a warp presence, not just the Psyker ones, all 20 of them. They exist simultaneously in physical reality and in the immaterium, and in the warp, their souls appear as something vast and terrible monuments of psychic mass that lesser entities avoid and greater entities must respect. When a Primarch walks onto a battlefield, the warp registers it. Their emotions, their will, their identity ripples outward into the immaterium. Their physical strikes carry warp force behind them. Their aura affects everything in their vicinity. This is why armies fight differently in their presence, not just through inspiration and morale, but through a literal psychic influence that connects every Space Marine, carrying that Primarch's gene seed to their father's emotional state. All of this is before we have looked at a single specific feat. This is the baseline. This is what we mean when we say Primarch. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from and what time is it? I want to see every country, every time zone, every city. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do that now. This is going to be a long one, and you'll want to catch everything that comes after. Section 2. The physical body, documented feats, and what the lore actually says. Let us begin with physical size, because size is the first thing that tells you these are categorically different from anything else in their setting. Games Workshop has never locked down official heights for the Primarchs, and the Black Library authors have written them at different scales, depending on their narrative needs, which has produced a range of descriptions that fans have been debating for years. But certain textual evidence stands out. In Dan Abnett's Horus Rising, widely considered one of the definitive Horus Heresy novels, Horus has to kneel down fully and completely to look Garviel Loken in the eye during an emotionally significant conversation. Loken is a Space Marine. Working from the commonly accepted estimate that Space Marines stand roughly 8 feet tall, Horus in that moment is somewhere in the 12 to 14 foot range, at minimum. He did not lean. He did not duck. He knelt to meet his captain's gaze, and the gesture required him to lower himself by several feet. In Chris Wraith's work covering Jagatai Khan, the Great Khan is described as being twice the height of one of his White Scars legionaries. The White Scars recruit from Chogorian populations that tend towards slightly shorter builds than some other worlds. But even on a generous Space Marine minimum, twice the height of an Astartes warrior places the Khan in the range of 14 to 16 feet. This is not a small human. This is, by any reasonable definition, a giant. Vulkan, the Lord of Drakes, Primarch of the Salamanders, is described consistently across sources as the physically largest of the 20 brothers. Not just tallest, but the broadest and most heavily muscled. A mountain given the approximate shape of a man. Some accounts push estimates toward 20 feet in full Terminator armor. Even the conservative estimates place him near the top of anything the setting describes as organic. Magnus the Red was so enormous that standard Primarch power armor could not be constructed to accommodate his frame. He famously went into many campaigns, wearing only a breastplate over his torso, arms exposed, because his body could not be fitted into a complete suit without restricting the movement he needed for his extensive psychic gesture work. At the small end, Alfarius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, the shortest of the 20, could pass as exceptionally large, imposing Astartes, which was the deliberate point of their design philosophy. But even they, at what amounts to the minimum Primarch scale, were described as carrying a presence that stopped veterans of decades of service in their tracks. The compactness was not reassurance. It was a tiger's kind of compact, now for what those bodies can do. Because all the size in the world is abstract until it is attached to specific, documented events. Start with what is probably the single most viscerally described display of Primarch physical strength in the entire Horus Heresy canon. Leman Russ lifting Magnus the Red and breaking him across his knee at the climax of the burning of Prospero. The context matters as much as the act itself. Magnus had not wanted this fight. He had accepted the punishment the Emperor was sending as just, had told his sons to stand down, had made his peace with the destruction of Prospero as earned consequence of his mistakes. But watching his sons die around him, cut down by the fury of the space wolves he had genuinely believed were his brothers, pushed him past the limit of his acceptance. And when Magnus finally descended onto the field, he came at full power. The lore descriptions of his arrival are extraordinary. He appeared in his golden artificer armor, his wild red hair blazing with active psychic energy, literal flames of warp fire curling from it. His bladed staff was throwing off arcs of lightning that destroyed armored vehicles in single strikes. His one good eye killed warriors outright, driving them into permanent psychic madness simply by making contact. He had enhanced himself further with active sorcery, layering his natural psychic power with additional empowerments, specifically to survive the Wolf King's assault. He was enormous, he was furious, he was desperate, and he was possibly the most powerful psychic being in the galaxy outside the Emperor himself. Leman Russ walked toward him anyway, just walked, through the lightning, through the psychic pressure, through everything Magnus was projecting outward. And he was grinning. What followed was a fight that multiple witnesses failed to adequately describe in language afterward. Magnus struck Russ hard enough to shatter his breastplate and pierce one of his hearts. Not crack the breastplate, shatter it. Not bruise the chest, puncture the heart. A wound of that severity would have killed a standard space marine through cardiovascular collapse within minutes. Russ kept moving. Magnus drove his arm into Russ's body in a maneuver that implied tearing rather than striking. Russ broke that arm. Then he grabbed Magnus, the huge, desperate, still sorcery-enhanced, still fighting Magnus, and lifted him overhead in a single motion. Then he brought him down across his knee and broke his spine. The sound of it echoed like a gunshot in the heart of every thousand son on the field. Not metaphorically, the father bond that links every Primarch to his genetic sons transmitted the agony of that moment through the psychic connection, reaching warriors across the burning city simultaneously. As Magnus crumpled, and the sky above Prospero bled oily warp tears, Russ raised his frost blade, Mjolnir, for the killing blow, and Magnus triggered a desperate, last-resort warp ritual that teleported him and the surviving thousand sons entirely off-world, abandoning Prospero forever to escape death at his brother's hands. A heart punctured by a direct blow from a Primarch-level strike, continued fighting. That is what Primarch endurance looks like when it is made specific. Ferrus Manus's feat on Medusa is foundational to everything about the Iron Hands as a chapter and as a cultural institution, and it is presented in the lore as historical reality rather than pure mythology, even if the Imperium has wrapped it in the trappings of myth over the millennia. Acernoth was a creature that existed in both the physical reality and the immaterium simultaneously, a warp-touched apex predator that ordinary weapons could not affect. Ferrus found it in an area of active volcanic geography and dove into the lava flow to pursue it, into material that runs at temperatures between 700 and 1,200 degrees Celsius at minimum, hot enough to melt rock, hot enough to reduce ordinary matter to undifferentiated liquid. He wrestled Acernoth beneath the molten surface until the creature's metallic essence had merged with his flesh and he could drag it back out. He walked out of the lava with new hands that would remain part of his biology integrated into his nervous system, as sensitive as flesh, while being immeasurably stronger for the rest of his life. Silver hands that were not prosthetics or implants, but genuine biological growth, incorporating alien warp metal into his own body. He survived immersion in active lava as a young man on his home world, and his response was to use the experience to upgrade himself, Sanguinius and Kabanda. This deserves its own extended passage, because Kabanda is not a minor daemon who happened to wander onto the battlefield. Kabanda is a bloodthirster of Khorne, a greater daemon of specific and extreme power, described in the lore as one of the most potent entities Khorne had ever sent into the material world, an engine of divine destruction who sought Sanguinius specifically and personally across the entire span of the siege. A bloodthirster of Kabanda's magnitude is something that Space Marine forces plan entire campaigns to avoid engaging directly. The casualties from even an indirect engagement with a daemon of this category are severe. Kabanda descended on the Imperial Palace defenses with the specific intent of hunting the angel, driven by a Khornate obsession with claiming Sanguinius's skull. Sanguinius met it. He physically broke both of the daemon's legs, then cast it away from him with such force that the impact of his rejection, physical and psychic, simultaneously banished Kabanda back through the veil into the warp. Not a weapon that sent it back. Not a ritual or a prayer or a carefully constructed demonic binding. Sanguinius broke its legs with his hands and threw it hard enough to banish it from reality. Kabanda came back. Greater daemons always come back from banishment given time. That is the nature of what they are. And when it returned to the siege, Sanguinius broke it again, twice, in the same conflict. The most powerful bloodthirster Khorne had dispatched was physically dismantled and discarded by the Angel, not once, but twice in the course of a single war. Between these two encounters, Sanguinius held the outer defenses of the Imperial Palace in passages of the Siege of Terra novels that make your pulse go. He used his wings as weapons in close combat, folded and driven through armored bodies with the force of a speeding ground car, the leading edges functioning as blades when his spear was occupied. He destroyed aircraft from the ground with thrown weapons. He killed Chaos Space Marines in such numbers that even his own sons, watching him, felt something shift from inspiration toward the uncanny. Then he walked into the vengeful spirit, knowing through his precognitive gift, through the visions that had haunted him for years, that he was walking to his death, and he went anyway. Angron's feats occupy their own category, because Angron is one of the most complicated subjects in the Primarch power conversation. The Butcher's Nail's crude psychosurgical cortical implants, hammered into his skull when he was a slave gladiator on Nuceria, designed to suppress fear and inhibit the brain's ability to feel anything except aggression, gave him a fighting fury that exceeded even other Primarchs in raw berserker intensity. But the nails were also slowly killing him, degrading his brain over decades, replacing the man with an engine of destruction. He was widely considered, alongside Vulkan and Ferris, as one of the three most physically powerful Primarchs in terms of raw strength. His twin chain axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, were weapons that embodied his fighting philosophy, not precision, not technique, but overwhelming force applied without restraint. His combat record throughout the Great Crusade included victories over other Primarchs, battles where he simply broke through opposition that should have been able to hold him. His ascension to daemon princehood, performed by Lorgar through a ritual during the Battle of Nuceria, triggered when the Butcher's Nails had degraded Angron's mortal brain to the point of imminent death, transformed him into something that made his living self look like a rough draft. The being that emerged from that ritual and subsequently led the World Eaters at the Siege of Terra was described as the Herald of Horus himself, a figure so wrapped in Khorne's divine fury that entire Imperial defensive lines broke simply at his approach. He fought Sanguinius in an aerial battle above the Eternity Gate, impaling the Angel on his black blade, though Sanguinius, in turn, ripped out Angron's Butcher's Nails, which caused such explosive psychic trauma that the Daemon Primarch's head essentially detonated, temporarily banishing him from the field, Sanguinius killing him through her own death, in a sense, each of them taking the other out of the battle. In the 41st millennium, Angron has returned to real space multiple times. His most significant appearance was the First War for Armageddon in approximately 444 M41, where he manifested at the head of a vast Khornate war host and proceeded to tear apart one of the most heavily defended hive worlds in the Imperium. The Imperial response required 4 full Space Marine chapters, 2 Titan legions, and more than 30 Imperial Guard regiments, and even this coalition force did not so much defeat Angron as outlast his manifestation. He was banished by the Grey Knights at tremendous cost, but not destroyed. The lore makes clear that the reason Angron can be banished but not permanently destroyed in real space is that Khorne's investment in him is now so complete that eliminating him entirely would require not just ending his material form, but somehow reaching his patron god. The Daemon Primarch of Khorne cannot be killed by anything that operates below divine scale. Vulkan's endurance feats require their own dedicated passage because they constitute the most extreme physical punishment any single character in the entire Horus Heresy series absorbs and survives. At the Drop Site Massacre on Istvan V, the Iron Warriors detonated nuclear weapons targeting directly at the Salamanders' position. This was not an accident of battle or collateral damage. They aimed atomic warheads at the place where Vulkan was standing, with the explicit understanding that this might be sufficient to end him. The detonation zone reduced his legion to ashes. Vulkan stood up. He was then surrounded by hundreds of Iron Warriors and Night Lords. He was stabbed, shot, bludgeoned. He was driven to unconsciousness. Konrad Curze recognized the opportunity and took Vulkan prisoner rather than allowing the killing blow to be delivered, sensing something he wanted to explore. What followed over the next several months is one of the most disturbing passages in Warhammer 40K fiction. Curze systematically killed Vulkan, multiple times. He cut off his head. He stabbed him through the heart. He had him eviscerated. He had him shot with hundreds of bolters simultaneously at close range. He had him sealed into the engine exhaust shaft of a starship, which generates temperatures and pressures that can vaporize Terminator-grade ceramite. He had him thrown naked into the void of space. Every time, Vulkan's body regenerated, and he woke up again. This is when the lore revealed that Vulkan was a perpetual, a category of beings, of which the Emperor himself is the most prominent example, who possess complete cellular regeneration down to the molecular level. A perpetual can regrow from a scorch mark. They can return from vaporization. Death, for a perpetual, is an extremely inconvenient temporary state rather than a permanent outcome. Konrad Curze, in his obsessive determination to prove that nothing was truly unbreakable, had accidentally discovered the one Primarch who was physically impossible to permanently end. Physically impossible. Not very difficult. Impossible. Curze spent months trying to kill him and never succeeded. Vulkan eventually escaped, using one of his own artifacted weapons as an improvised teleporter, fell through Makrage's upper atmosphere while regenerating from whatever his most recent death had been, crash-landed on Guilliman's homeworld in a state that would have constituted death for anything else, and eventually pulled himself together sufficiently to make his way to Terra. That is Vulkan's physical baseline. The other physical dimension that the lore returns to repeatedly is speed. Jagatai Khan, the Great Khan of the White Scars, was universally acknowledged as the fastest of the 20 in terms of movement and attack speed. His combat style was built entirely around this fact. He did not attempt to absorb hits with physical durability. He was simply somewhere else before the hits arrived. Accounts of him in battle describe Space Marines, who are already operating at reflexes that make ordinary humans look frozen, being unable to track what he was doing. He moved between targets faster than the perception of his own warriors could keep up with. The White Scars Legion's entire tactical doctrine was a direct expression of their Primarch's defining gift. If you are fast enough, the enemy's plans become irrelevant before they can be executed. Sanguinius carried speed of a different kind, three-dimensional speed, enabled by wings that actually functioned, that could carry a being of his mass at genuine combat velocity. No other Primarch could engage in the aerial dimension he moved through. Curze and Korax moved with a predator's ghost-like swiftness that made them effectively invisible at crucial moments. All of the Primarchs, even the physically heavier ones like Vulkan and Angron, are described as moving faster than anything their size should be capable of, because the biology underlying their muscle systems and their nervous systems was built without the usual biological constraint that larger mass requires proportionally more time to accelerate. The weapons they carried are worth mentioning in this section because they tell you something about the scale of force these beings were regularly applying. Ferrus Manus's hammer Forgebreaker was specifically noted as requiring Primarch-level strength to wield effectively, not Primarch-level strength as a nice-to-have. Primarch-level strength as a minimum requirement. Standard Space Marines could not use it as an effective combat weapon. When Ferrus died and Fulgrim claimed it as a trophy, it eventually passed to Perturabo, who was specifically noted as being among the Primarchs with sufficient physical capability to swing it in combat, and Perturabo was himself in the upper tier of raw physical power. A weapon that the upper tier of physical capability, among the most powerful beings ever created by humanity, could barely manage, tells you something about what Ferrus Manus was regularly doing with it. Rogel Dorn during the Siege of Terra provides one of the most sustained physical endurance demonstrations in the lore. He fought continuously for days without sleep or respite, while simultaneously coordinating the defense of the entire Imperial Palace complex. His armor took damage that Tech Marines had to repair while he was still wearing it, because removing it for maintenance was not a luxury the siege permitted. He fought through wounds that would have ended Space Marines. He held positions personally when the lines were breaking, appearing wherever his presence was most urgently needed, because the nature of the siege demanded someone who could be everywhere, and he was the one available to try. Section 3. The Mind and Will, where things become genuinely incomprehensible. Physical strength in a Primarch, as extraordinary as it is almost the least interesting dimension of their power. This is a peculiar thing to say about beings who can lift war engines and snap the spines of the most powerful psychic entities in the galaxy, but it is accurate. Because the mind of a Primarch is where the Warhammer 40K lore stops being able to use reference points entirely. Every Primarch is a genius. Not by the standard of human achievement, that framing is still too limited. They are geniuses by standards that even the finest human intellects cannot reach. When Robout Guillemon arrived on Macragge, he mastered everything the planet knew. Philosophy, history, science, mathematics, law, military theory, governance, trade economics by the age of 10. Not surveyed it, mastered it completely, with retention and understanding that professional practitioners found humbling. He then used that mastery to transform an entire world's political and economic structure, suppress a long-standing rebellion, build interplanetary trade, and develop a military that impressed the Emperor. Guillemon is not even considered the single most intellectually capable of the 20 in terms of raw processing speed. He is the greatest organizer and administrator. Magnus the Red could hold the full contents of Prospero's great library in active recall while conducting complex psychic calculations and maintaining an unrelated conversation about an entirely different subject. He processed information at a rate that made the best scholarly minds on his planet look like they were learning their first letters. Perturabo solved abstract mathematical theorems as a child for recreation, wept at their elegance, and regarded the fact that no one around him could appreciate what he was doing as one of the early signals that he was profoundly, painfully alone in a way no Primarch should have been. Lorgar absorbed and synthesized every theological tradition he encountered across the entire Great Crusade, building a comprehensive philosophy of faith and devotion that integrated thousands of belief systems into something coherent. His intellectual capacity in the domain of theology was not academic. It was a genuine, burning need to understand the nature of divinity, and his inability to find what he was looking for in the Emperor's materialist imperial truth was the first crack in the foundation that eventually brought the heresy. The Primarchs think faster than humans in ways that are not simply quantitative, but qualitative. They do not just process information more quickly. They process different kinds of information simultaneously, in a way that no human brain is architecturally capable of. A Primarch watching a battle does not see what a general sees, a map with positions and probabilities and logistical considerations. They see a living system of interconnected dynamics, every action's cascade of consequences, traceable forward through probabilistic models. They run continuously in real time, updating as new data arrives. They give orders to thousands of individual units simultaneously, track them all, adjust in real time based on developments across the entire field, and do all of this while personally fighting in whatever sector needs their immediate physical presence. Horus, at his peak, coordinated the Great Crusade's largest expeditionary fleets, with the kind of granular personal attention to individual unit needs and capabilities that smaller commands struggle to maintain. He read the emotional state of every officer under his command and calibrated his interactions with them accordingly. He made decisions in fractions of seconds that experienced imperial commanders would have needed hours to work through. And he did all of this while projecting an aura of absolute certainty and charismatic authority that made everyone around him feel that the right choice had already been made and they simply needed to execute it. This brings us to will, which is the second great dimension of Primarch power after intelligence, and in some ways, the more practically significant one. Primarch will is not stubbornness or determination in the ordinary sense. It is a force that operates on something close to a physical level, a psychic weight that presses on the consciousness of everyone near them. When a Primarch speaks, something beyond the words reaches the listener. When a Primarch commands, something in the command touches a part of human and transhuman psychology that normal authority does not reach. Sanguinius was the most beloved of all the Primarchs, and the word beloved is doing something unusual here. People who encountered him once, briefly, in passing, described it as among the most significant moments of their lives. His presence left an impression in people at a depth that normal charisma and normal authority simply do not reach. Something in his warp signature, in the way his soul expressed itself through his physical form, created a connection with every person he touched that was deeper than ordinary admiration. His sons, the Blood Angels, would die for him in ways that went past duty into something closer to devotion, not because they were ordered to, but because the alternative was literally unimaginable to them. The practical battlefield implications of this cannot be overstated. An army with its Primarch present fights fundamentally differently from one fighting without him. Not just in morale terms, in literal psychic terms. The gene bond that connects Space Marines to their Primarch transmits emotional state bidirectionally. When Sanguinius held steady, his sons found clarity. When Leman Russ's rage was up, the Space Wolves burned with it. When Angron's pain and fury flowed through him, it leaked into the World Eaters and amplified whatever aggression was already there, which is part of why the World Eaters gradually became less of a legion and more of a natural disaster in humanoid form. The soul of a Primarch also carries a legacy dimension that is unique to their position. The gene seed that Space Marines carry is derived from Primarch DNA, and the bond it creates runs in both directions. A Primarch can feel their sons. Sanguinius is the extreme example. His death at Horus's hands on the vengeful spirit sent a psychic shockwave through every Blood Angel simultaneously, including those on the other side of the galaxy. The shockwave inscribed his final moments of agony and desperate fight into the genetic memory of every Blood Angel that ever lived after that day. That inscription became the Black Rage, the madness that can strike Blood Angels at any time, in which they relive their Primarch's last moments in total, unfiltered, agonizing clarity. 10,000 years later, the sound of Sanguinius dying is still present in the cells of his sons, waiting. That is the depth of a Primarch's soul. It does not end when they do. Section 4, the Psyker Primarchs, where strength becomes something else entirely. Not all Primarchs channel the warp as active Psykers. Most of them have warp presence and warp influence, but the ability to reach into the immaterium and pull from it consciously, to throw fire that burns things, conventional physics cannot burn, to see across stellar distances, to manipulate matter and probability and reality, belongs to a specific subset of the 20. Magnus the Red is the obvious beginning, because Magnus is to psychic power what Ferrus Manus is to raw physical strength, the singular acknowledged pinnacle, the one against whom all others are measured. The Emperor himself noted Magnus's psychic capabilities as extraordinary, as something that demanded careful management, not because Magnus was untrustworthy, but because his power was so extreme that the collateral damage of his learning process was a genuine civilizational concern. Before his fall and transformation into a daemon prince of Tzeentch, Magnus performed feats that made even experienced psychers across the galaxy pale. He developed theories of psychic power that his most advanced teachers on Prospero could not follow. He communicated psychically across stellar distances as a matter of routine. He manipulated matter and energy at will. He developed a cure for the flesh change, the mutation devastating his legion through a private bargain with Tzeentch that he did not fully understand at the time, trading away pieces of his soul for solutions to immediate problems in a pattern that the Changer of Ways had been carefully constructing for decades. The single most dramatic display of Magnus's raw psychic power in the pre-heresy era came when he sent his desperate warning to Terra about Horus's corruption. The Emperor had constructed powerful psychic wards around his secret Webway project defenses, carefully maintained by the most powerful psyker in existence, protecting a project of extraordinary delicacy. Magnus, frantic to reach his father, threw himself at those wards, not with precision, not with nuance, with volume, with the sheer weight of everything he had, poured into a single psychic transmission that he drove through the Emperor's defenses by force. The wards shattered. The Webway project collapsed. Daemons flooded through the breach into the space beneath the Imperial Palace. Terra itself came under psychic threat for the first time in the project's history. The consequences were catastrophic for everyone, including Magnus. But the display itself, the psychic barriers maintained by the Emperor of Mankind, destroyed through overwhelming force by his son, tells you something about what Magnus was capable of when he stopped being careful. After Prospero, after his soul shattered during the desperate escape through the warp, after decades and then centuries of being remade by Tzeentch in the Eye of Terror, Magnus became something that made his Great Crusade self look like early developmental work. When he fought Vulkan repeatedly during the Siege of Terra, and this conflict has some of the most detailed Primarch combat in the Siege of Terra novel series. He demonstrated abilities refined over years of intensive Scientian patronage. He could destroy Vulkan. He could disintegrate him at the molecular level. The problem was that Vulkan kept coming back. Their conflict was less a straightforward fight than a grinding philosophical contest between an unstoppable regenerative force and an irresistible sorcerous power. His confrontation with Guilliman during the Terran Crusade after Guilliman's resurrection and his attempt to travel to Terra was described in the Dark Imperium-era novels as one of the most significant Primarch engagements of the New Age. Magnus, attracted by or actively seeking whatever drew him to the region, attacked the Crusade fleet with a force that included his 1,000 sons and significant demonic support. Guilliman, wielding the Emperor's sword and wearing the armor of fate, fought him directly. The engagement was genuine and dangerous. Neither party emerged with a decisive victory. Guilliman eventually escaped into the webway, which is the correct strategic choice against an opponent of Magnus's psychic capability in an open engagement. Not every fight needs to be won by standing and finishing it. Lorgar Aurelian presents a case where psychic power grew through choice rather than being the defining trait of the design. Lorgar was not born with Magnus's raw power. His gifts were more subtle. The voice, the word, the ability to understand and manipulate belief at a fundamental level. But after his pilgrimage, after his full commitment to the Chaos Gods, after decades of direct tutelage from the ruinous powers themselves, his power grew into something that surprised even beings who had known him for years. In the Horus Heresy novel Betrayer, Lorgar wounded Horus in direct combat. Horus, the War Master of Chaos, empowered by divine chaos patronage. The being who killed Sanguinius took a wound from Lorgar, not a trivial scratch, a genuine wound that Horus registered and acknowledged. When Lorgar was fully committed and fully empowered, he was operating at a level that the most powerful version of any of his brothers had to take seriously. Corvus Corax is worth a brief mention in this section because his specific ability, the capacity to become effectively invisible, to interact with light in ways that physical optics should not permit, to move through environments in ways that made even space marines uncertain whether they were fighting one enemy or many, has the texture of a psychic gift, even if the lore has never fully confirmed it as such. He impaled Lorgar during the Drop Site Massacre and was about to finish the traitor before Curze intervened. He fought his way out of Istvan V with a handful of survivors, in circumstances that, by any calculation, should have resulted in his death and the complete destruction of his force. His ability to be somewhere other than where the enemy was looking for him was not just tactical skill, it was something that reached further than tactics. Sanguinius's precognition deserves more than a passing mention. He knew years before the siege that he was going to die on the vengeful spirit. The visions were specific enough that he could describe the circumstances, could name Horus as the one who would kill him, could articulate what the fight would feel like. This is not vague prophetic unease. This is a specific, detailed, accurate foresight into a future event that he had no rational means of predicting. And he walked into that prediction anyway, because the alternative not going, not fighting, not buying the Emperor the moment he needed was not an option he could accept. In a combat context, this precognition expressed as something that made his reflexes seem almost impossible to observers. He was moving to positions before the attack that required being there arrived. He was deflecting weapons before the strikes were committed. He was never quite where the enemy was aiming. Not always, not infallibly, not against an opponent as powerful as chaos-empowered Horus, but often enough, consistently enough, that witnesses described him as moving through combat with a quality that bordered on the supernatural, even by Primarch standards. Section 5. The top tier, and the honest case for each. If you assembled the 20 Primarchs in one place at equivalent levels of power and asked who wins, which is, with modifications for chaos enhancement and current storyline status, essentially the question the Horus Heresy and its aftermath explored: who are we actually talking about at the very top? With the usual honest caveat that no ranking can be definitive across sources, as inconsistent as this body of lore, here is the evidence for the beings who sit at the absolute peak. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the firstborn in terms of discovery, if not necessarily creation, though the order question is itself debated. His pre-fall self, was the most complete Primarch in existence, not defined by a single superlative attribute, but by having every attribute at a higher combined level than any of his brothers achieved in that aggregate. The Emperor chose him as War Master, not through nepotism, all 20 of his sons were his beloved creations, but through the genuine recognition that Horus combined strategic genius, personal combat capability, force of personality, and the ability to manage the other Primarchs in ways that no single other candidate quite matched. His fall did not diminish him, it refracted him. The Chaos Gods collectively invested everything they had in their chosen instrument, all 4 ruinous powers, simultaneously, pouring their divine energy into the War Master, transforming him from an extraordinary Primarch into something that had ceased to be simply a mortal being, and had become a vessel for forces that predate human civilization. The Horus, who stood on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, who killed Sanguinius and nearly killed the Emperor, was carrying the combined will and power of beings whose influence extends across the entire span of conscious life in the galaxy. He required the Emperor of mankind at full commitment to destroy. Nothing else in the setting can claim that. Sanguinius, the great angel. His natural combat capability, the specific combination of physical power, speed enabled by flight, precognitive reflexes, psychic sensitivity, and the pure integrated grace of his fighting style made him arguably the most perfectly designed individual combatant among the 20. He was not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most psychically powerful in isolation, but the synthesis of his attributes into a fighting style produced something that his brothers acknowledged as extraordinary, even by their own extraordinary standards. His record stands on its own. Kabanda twice. The siege's defenses held past the point they should have broken. His fight with chaos-empowered Horus that left a crack in the War Master's armor, a crack the Emperor then used to reach Horus's soul. The argument that Sanguinius's death was a failure is wrong on every level. He died knowing he was going to die. He died having accomplished something that was necessary for the Emperor to complete his task. He died as a deliberate act of will, the last in a long series of deliberate, heroic acts. Leman Russ, the Wolf King. The burning of Prospero established his physical credentials, definitively lifting and breaking the back of the most powerful psychic being in the galaxy, outside the Emperor. After having a heart punctured and continuing to fight, is a set of facts that does not require much elaboration. But his specific anti-psychic properties are what place him in this tier for the current era, rather than just the historical one. He was apparently designed, whether deliberately by the Emperor or as an emergent property of his creation, to be extraordinarily resistant to psychic attack. Magnus's sorcery, which should have been an overwhelming advantage against any physical combatant, could not reliably reach Russ. He was not immune to everything Magnus could do, but he was immune enough that the fight came down to the physical dimension, and in the physical dimension, he broke his brother. In an era full of daemon Primarchs, whose primary advantage over loyalist forces is their ability to reach into the warp and apply divine power directly, a Primarch who is specifically resistant to that dimension of attack is extraordinarily valuable. This is why the Space Wolf prophecy of the Wolftime Russ's return at the final battle resonates with something that feels structurally true about the setting, rather than just convenient narrative mythology. The Lion. Lion L. Johnson, the First, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, is the case for technical fighting mastery overcoming raw power. He is not the physically strongest. He is not the most psychically gifted. He is the finest individual duelist of the 20, the Primarch whose technical skill in the specific art of single combat exceeded all his brothers by the consistent assessment of the lore. The sixth sense he apparently possessed for changing between offensive and defensive styles, reacting to incoming attacks on a level that bordered on instinct rather than conscious processing, meant that opponents with genuine precognitive gifts, like Curze, found their advantage eliminated because the Lion was already doing what their precognition told them he would do differently. He bested Russ on Dulin, a fight the Space Wolves and Dark Angels have been arguing about for 10,000 years, with the most honest reading of the available lore, suggesting the Lion had the clear advantage before both sides' officers intervened. He defeated Curze in their extended game of predator and prey across the invincible Reason, with Curze stalking the ship's spaces and the Lion hunting him. He dismissed Kairos Fateweaver, a lord of change, one of the most dangerous servants of Tzientch, a being of immense power, by impaling it through the heart and remarking, with perfect dryness, on whether it had seen that coming. His current 41st millennium form, awakened after 10 millennia in the rock's depths, carries capabilities that seem, if anything, enhanced from his heresy-era self. He moves through the Dark Imperium, the chaos-blighted half of the galaxy, cut off by the Great Rift, where demonic entities rule, and reality itself is compromised, with a grim efficiency that his sons find both inspiring and slightly unsettling. The forest walk ability he has demonstrated since his awakening, the capacity to step through Mirror Caliban and emerge elsewhere, gives him a mobility that overlaps interestingly with Jagatai Khan's pure speed in terms of combat unpredictability. Section 6. Documented feats that require the brain to stop and recalibrate. This is the section that people share, the specific moments. The individual descriptions from Black Library, novels, and sourcebook materials, and established lore that make readers pause and reread what they just encountered. Because it cannot mean what it appears to mean, and then rereading confirms that it means exactly that. Let us go through them systematically. Infant feats first, because even these establish something important. The Primarchs grew so rapidly and so powerfully upon landing on their respective worlds that even the early accounts of their development read as myth, and they are intended to, because the Imperium has indeed turned these events into foundational mythology. But the core facts are consistent. Vulkan, at 3 years of age, larger and stronger than any adult on Nocturne, hunting the great saurians that threatened his community, working in the forge with proficiency that exceeded master craftsmen who had spent entire lives there. 3 years old. Ferrus Manus, essentially as an infant, diving into an active lava flow to fight a warp entity and walking out with new hands. Leman Russ, found in the wilderness, having been raised by wolves and being more dangerous than they were. Rabut Guillamon, at 10 years old, having mastered every field of knowledge his planet contained. These are not exceptional events by the standard of what Primarchs do. They are baseline. The first demonstrations of power that had been in them since before their birth. Now into the specific high-point combat feats. Russ versus Magnus, covered above in Section 2, but with additional context. Magnus had sorcerously enhanced himself before the fight, specifically to survive Russ. He was applying active empowerments on top of his already extraordinary natural power. The backbreaking happened with Russ, fighting through a punctured heart, against a Magnus who was making every possible effort to not be broken. The feat was accomplished against maximum resistance. Ferrus Manus and the lava covered above. The additional context worth adding. Acernoth was not simply a physical creature. It was warp-touched, existing in both physical reality and the immaterium simultaneously, which meant ordinary weapons could not affect it. Ferrus could not simply use a blade or a weapon to fight it. He had to take it into the lava, because that was the environment where his physical advantages mattered more than its nature. The intelligence of the approach, matching the right method to a seemingly impossible problem, is as striking as the physical execution. Sanguinius, at the Siege of Terra, extended version. The passages in the Siege of Terra novel series that cover Sanguinius defending the outer approaches are among the most memorable combat writing in any 40K fiction. He is simultaneously commanding the Blood Angel's defense, monitoring the broader strategic situation across the palace, making real-time tactical decisions about where to commit reserves, and personally fighting on the most dangerous sections of the wall. He destroys a corrupted gunship with his spear from the ground. He uses his wings as weapons. He holds positions where an honest assessment says he should be overwhelmed, and he holds them anyway. Not through strategy or tricks, but through the simple fact that the enemies on those walls have never faced anything like what they are fighting. Guilliman and Nurgle's Garden. In the War of Secrets and related Plague Wars lore, Guilliman fought through Nurgle's Garden, the pocket dimension the plague god maintains as his personal divine domain, a realm where Nurgle is essentially omnipotent and where the environment itself is hostile to anything that doesn't carry his blessing. The Emperor's sword burned the garden's substance, left marks on the divine landscape that the garden could not immediately repair. A portion of the Emperor's own psychic fire was scorching a chaos, God's personal realm. That is the scale Primarchs are operating at in the current 41st millennium. Perturabo versus Daemon Primarch, Angron. In the lore-covering events during the Horus Heresy, Perturabo confronted Angron after his ascension to Daemon princehood. A newly ascended Daemon Primarch of Khorne, fresh from transformation, is something that Space Marine forces call for orbital bombardment to avoid engaging. Perturabo engaged him and achieved enough of a result to move him away from a position that needed to be moved from. Not a clean victory, not a celebration, but controlling where a Daemon Primarch goes is a feat. The lion impaling Kairos Fateweaver. The Lord of Change is a greater daemon of Tzeentch, one of the most powerful daemons in the warp, a being of prophecy and scheming whose grasp of possible futures gives it a combat advantage that makes it difficult to fight in ways that are difficult to quantify. The lion's specific gift, that sixth sense that allowed him to adapt his fighting style below the level of conscious decision, meant that Kairos's precognitive advantage was neutralized. The lion moved in ways that Kairos's foreknowledge told it the lion would move differently. He shrugged off the Lord of Change's attempt to convert him to chaos by finding literally nothing in his heart that the entity could use Kairos, searched for a weakness and came up empty and then killed it. With a quip, Leman Russ, and fighting Horus during the Siege of Terra. Russ attacked Horus directly, attempting to reach the War Master before the Emperor could. The lore describes this confrontation as genuine, not Russ being immediately overwhelmed, but a real fight where Russ was pushing against chaos-empowered Horus with the full force of everything he had, including his specific resistance to the psychic advantages that empowerment provided. He did not succeed in killing Horus. But standing and fighting that version of Horus and not dying in the attempt is a statement in its own right. Corvus Corax, at Istvan V, and in its immediate aftermath. The Drop Site Massacre reduced the Raven Guard from a full legion to a shattered remnant. Corax fought for 98 days in the aftermath, leading what remained of his force in a guerrilla campaign on the surface of Istvan V against traitor forces that massively outnumbered his own. He killed Lorgar in the initial engagement, impaled him, had him dead, and was interrupted by Curze. He escaped from a situation where escape should have been impossible. The sustained fight against overwhelming odds in an environment controlled by his enemies for nearly 100 days demonstrates something about his capabilities that single dramatic moments don't fully capture. He is one of the hardest Primarchs to corner, and one of the hardest to stop, even when everything has gone wrong. Section 7 Primarchs versus everything else. The broader power picture. We have spent considerable time inside the Primarch versus Primarch conversation. But the 40K universe is not a closed system. The galaxy is full of entities and factions of extraordinary individual and collective power, and placing the Primarchs correctly requires understanding where they sit against those threats as well. Greater daemons are the most commonly encountered extreme individual threat in the setting. A bloodthirster, a Lord of Change, a great unclean one, a keeper of secrets. These are beings that Space Marine forces plan entire campaigns to avoid direct engagement with, because direct engagement typically results in catastrophic casualties. They exist partly in the warp, which means conventional physical attacks are less effective. They regenerate. They are empowered by the worship and violence and emotion flowing into the warp. They can tear through Astartes' formations. Primarchs kill them. Sanguinius killed Kabanda twice. Throughout the heresy, and in the various accounts of the current era, Primarchs have engaged greater daemons and come away with victories far more often than defeats. The weapons a Primarch typically carries help with this. Most Primarch-grade armaments include some form of anti-demonic enhancement, or are simply powerful enough that the daemon's resistance to physical damage doesn't matter when the blow is delivered with sufficient force. But even a Primarch fighting a greater daemon without specifically anti-demonic equipment tends to win, because the raw power differential is sufficient. Daemon Primarchs represent the escalation. A Daemon Primarch is a being who was already a Primarch, already at the level we have been describing throughout this discussion, and then was transformed by direct divine chaos patronage into something that exists, simultaneously as mortal general and demigod champion. They have had centuries or millennia to develop their capabilities further within the Eye of Terror. Angron, Mortarion, Magnus, Fulgrim, Lorgar, Perturabo, all of them are fundamentally different from their heresy-era selves. Angron after Ascension is perhaps the most extreme example of what divine power does to a Primarch baseline. As a mortal, even with the Butcher's nails degrading his brain, he was among the most dangerous individual fighters in the galaxy. As the Red Angel, Daemon Primarch of Khorne, he is a being so completely invested with Khorne's divine fury that his very presence on a battlefield changes the nature of the fighting around him. The killing he does feeds the warp and brings more power back to him. The more violence surrounds him, the stronger he becomes. He cannot be permanently destroyed by anything operating below divine scale, because Khorne will simply reconstitute him. His only real vulnerability is the physical limitation of how long he can sustain a manifestation in real space, which is why the first war for Armageddon ended with his banishment rather than his destruction. The Grey Knights did not end him. They outlasted him. Against Necron forces, particularly the Cetan Shards fragments of the ancient star gods, whose power predates anything else in the setting, Primarchs are genuinely tested in ways that are qualitatively different from fighting organic or warp-based threats. Catan existed before humanity. Their original forms were entities who fed on stars and fought wars in the galaxy's infancy that make the Horus Heresy look like a regional dispute. Even the Shards, bound and diminished by the Necrons who shattered their masters, carry a kind of power that does not interact with the warp the way most other extreme threats do. Primarchs engaging Cetan Shards in the lore are not guaranteed victories. These are genuine contests. The Tyrannid hive mind presents the limit case of how individual power fails against collective scale. Even the most powerful Tyrannid organisms, hive tyrants, the vast living creatures the hive fleet deploys as weapons, are below Primarch level individually. But the hive mind is not an individual entity. It is a distributed consciousness, directing billions of organisms simultaneously. The devastation of Baal, the full weight of Hive Fleet Leviathan's largest tendril descending on the Blood Angel's home system, was not going to be resolved by personal combat, regardless of how powerful any individual fighter was. It was interrupted by an external event, the emergence of the Great Rift and the daemonic eruptions that followed, distracting the hive mind at a critical moment. Without that external intervention, the full gathering of Blood Angels and their successor, chapters, was going to be overwhelmed. Individual power, at sufficient scale differential, is simply not enough. The orcs operate on a collective psychic principle. The Gestalt belief of the entire species generates warp energy that literally makes their weapons work better and their warriors fight harder. A sufficiently enormous orc gathering creates a psychic field that is qualitatively different from a simply very large collection of individually dangerous warriors. Primarchs have killed orc warbosses throughout the lore, some casually and some after genuine effort. The casual ones make the point about individual power comparison. The non-casual ones make the point about what happens when collective scale is invoked. The honest assessment of where Primarchs sit in the galactic power hierarchy is this: they are at the absolute ceiling of what individual beings operating primarily in physical reality can accomplish. They operate above greater daemons, above orc warbosses regardless of size, above every category of mortal warrior or commander in the setting. They operate below daemon Primarchs, except when equipped with specific divine weapons or specific counter abilities. They operate below the full expression of Cetan power. They operate far below the Chaos Gods themselves. And they are unable to solve problems that require collective force rather than individual power, no matter how extraordinary that individual power is. Section 8. The Emperor, the absolute ceiling, and what it tells us. The Emperor of mankind is the hard ceiling of this conversation. He is what Primarchs are to Space Marines. The ratio repeats itself one more time, at the very top of the hierarchy. The Emperor created the Primarchs from his own genetic material, enhanced them with warp power he acquired through results that no other being has replicated, and made them the finest things he knew how to make. And then he was still, dramatically, categorically more powerful than all of them combined. There are accounts of ordinary Space Marines encountering the Emperor in his sanctum and finding themselves physically unable to stand in his presence, not through awe or ceremonial tradition, but literally unable to maintain their bodies against the psychic pressure of his existence. Space Marines, who are themselves warp-touched and considerably more resistant to psychic influence than ordinary humans, required active effort to remain functional in close proximity to the Emperor. Primarchs could stand before him, argue with him, feel the gap, but they could stand. The most important thing to understand about the Emperor's power level relative to the final siege is that he was not fighting at anything approaching his maximum capability during that period. He had been bound to the Golden Throne project for years before the siege began, pouring enormous psychic energy into maintaining the Astronomicon, managing the daemonic breach that Magnus's warning had opened in the webway, providing strategic guidance to the defense while his sons held the walls. He arrived at his confrontation with Horus depleted, carrying the grief of Sanguinius's death, having walked through his son's body to reach the War Master. And he destroyed Horus completely, not incapacitated him, not mortally wounded him, destroyed him utterly, down to the soul, so completely that the combined will of all four Chaos gods could not reconstitute him. Horus, the being that was carrying the combined power of four divine forces that predate human civilization, was unmade by the Emperor in a single act of total commitment. The cost was everything the Emperor had remaining. He emerged with nothing left to sustain a physical existence, but the act was accomplished. The implication is either that the Emperor, even thoroughly depleted and fighting under the worst possible conditions, was sufficient to destroy the most powerful version of Horus, meaning the gap between him and maximum chaos-empowered Primarch is larger than it appears. Or that the fight was genuinely dangerous and its outcome uncertain under different conditions, meaning chaos-empowered Horus was close enough to threaten the Emperor. Most lore interpretations favor the former. The Emperor chose to spend everything rather than preserve himself, but the choice was made from a position of sufficient power to guarantee the outcome if he was willing to pay that price. Above the Emperor sit the Chaos gods. The ruinous powers are not beings in any sense that ordinary beings can be. They are forces. The accumulated psychic energy of every war ever fought, every obsessive thought ever had, every disease and decay ever endured, every sensation of excess ever pursued, across the entire span of conscious life in the galaxy. They exist in a dimension where they are essentially omnipotent within their own domain, and can reach into the material world to cause effects that no physical force can replicate or counter except through equivalent divine power. Primarchs can wound them. Guilliman's Emperor's sword burned Nurgle's garden, but cannot threaten them existentially. The Chaos gods are not entities that can be killed by any force currently operating in the setting. They would have to be starved of the psychic energy that sustains them, which means changing something fundamental about conscious life across the entire galaxy, which is not a project that has a near-term completion date. Within the hierarchy where meaningful comparisons apply, the Emperor is the absolute ceiling. Below him, closer than anything else, sit the greatest Primarchs in their most extreme expressions, and the distance from those Primarchs down to everything else is vast. Section 9. The Primarchs in the 41st Millennium. Giants in a changed galaxy. The 41st Millennium, specifically the era Indomitus, the period after the Great Rift split the galaxy and the Cicatrix Maledictum tore through reality, is not a time without Primarchs. The current storyline has brought several of them back into active service, and their return is reshaping the largest conflicts in the setting. Robut Guilliman was placed in a stasis field on Macragge after being mortally wounded by Fulgrim's chaos-tainted blade during the Battle of Thessaly, approximately 121 M31. The blade carried a metaphysical taint derived from the Kinnebrak anatheme, the same weapon that had nearly killed Horus on Davin's plague moon, and its corruption was beyond anything the Imperium's Medicae could. Address. The wound was not immediately lethal, but was untreatable in stasis, his body frozen in the moment of dying rather than actually dying. He was there for 10,000 years. His resurrection, through the combined efforts of Archmagos, Dominus Belisarius Cawl, and the Ynnari Eldar faction, required technology 10 millennia in the preparation and psychic intervention beyond anything the Adeptus Mechanicus possessed, independently. Cawl had been working on the problem since Guilliman himself gave him the instruction shortly after the second founding, if the worst happens, find a way. The Eldar of the Ynnari brought the ability to reach into the metaphysical wound and purify it, which required a combination of science and sorcery that Guilliman found deeply uncomfortable but was in no position to refuse. When Guilliman woke, his first observations were not inspiring speeches. They were precise, analytical assessments of 10,000 years of institutional decay, delivered with the cold fury of someone who had spent a significant portion of his conscious life building things to prevent exactly what had happened. His grief at what the Imperium had become, the decay, the superstition, the bureaucratic calcification of what had been intended as a rational civilization, came through in his earliest recorded statements and has shaped his entire approach to his role in the current era. He is bigger in the armor of fate than he was in the armor of reason. Whether this is because Call built the new armor to a more extreme specification, or because something about his preservation and revival changed him physically, is not entirely clear. The Emperor's sword he now carries is something that could not have been described in heresy-era terms. It burns with genuine divine fire, a portion of the Emperor's own psychic essence, embedded in a weapon that Guilliman wields in physical combat. Against warp entities, against the chaos corruption that saturates the current era, it is effective in ways that no conventional weapon can match. In combat, the modern Guilliman has demonstrated capabilities that arguably exceed his heresy-era self. His assault on Nurgle's garden, fighting through the plague, God's own divine domain with the Emperor's sword burning the garden's substance around him, represents a scope of individual combat power that goes beyond anything he demonstrated during the heresy when, despite being an exceptional warrior, he was primarily valued for his strategic and administrative capabilities, rather than personal combat supremacy. His confrontation with Magnus during the Terran Crusade is the defining engagement of his current era so far. He fought a daemon Primarch of 10,000 years, accumulated power, and did not simply lose. He withdrew strategically after a genuine engagement where neither party achieved a definitive outcome. Against a fully powered daemon Primarch of Tzientch, the Lord Commander of the Imperium wielded the Emperor's sword and the armor of fate, and held his ground long enough to make the choice to leave on his own terms. Lionel Johnson's return happened more recently in the narrative timeline. He was discovered in the deepest chambers of the rock, in a state between sleep and something else, tended for 10 millennia by the enigmatic Watchers in the Dark. When he woke, he had no memory of those years. He emerged with the mind and experience of his heresy-era self, but into a galaxy 10,000 years removed from everything he knew. His response to learning what the Imperium had become, what the Fallen represented, what Luther had done, all of this had to be processed in real time, while also responding to the immediate demands of fighting in the most dangerous half of the fractured galaxy. In the Dark Imperium, the Lion has been fighting with a precision and economy of force that his sons find extraordinary, even by their own extraordinary standards. He carries the Emperor's shield and new weapons suited to the current era. He has killed daemon princes in engagements that are described with the casualness of a veteran resolving problems they have encountered before. His specific intelligence, the paranoid genius who kept secrets and played long games and was routinely underestimated because his methods were subtle and his communication minimal, appears to be building towards something that the Dark Angels are aware of but not fully privy to. The Wolf King, Leman Russ, remains absent. He departed into the Eye of Terror in 211, M31 after the heresy, taking the warriors of his Varigir bodyguard and leaving Bjorn the Fell-Handed behind, with one instruction: tell them I will return at the wolf time. 10,000 years and counting, Bjorn, the oldest Space Marine dreadnought in existence, awakened periodically when his chapter needs the living memory of someone who was actually there, still waits. The Space Wolves' faith in Russ's return is not simple hope. It is a structural belief woven into their entire culture, sustained by prophecy and by the knowledge that a being who walked into the Eye of Terror to hunt daemons does not need to have died simply because he has not come back yet. The daemon Primarchs are all active on the traitor side of this conflict. Angron returns to real space repeatedly. Mortarion led the plague wars against Ultramar, the devastating assault on Guilliman's home territory, described in the War of Secrets and Plague War novels, and was eventually driven back, but not without inflicting serious damage and demonstrating what 10,000 years of Nurgle's favor does to a Primarch's capacity for attrition and biological warfare. Magnus reached his own tendrils into the Great Rift's opening and has been active in multiple theaters. Fulgrim has apparently reappeared in the recent 41st Millennium narrative. Lorgar is believed to be in a long meditative communion with the Chaos Gods, developing something. The pattern of the current age is clear. The Primarchs are the primary actors in the largest conflicts, on both sides, and the galaxy's fate is being shaped by their encounters with each other in ways that armies of ordinary warriors simply cannot influence. Section 10. All 20 assessed. The complete accounting. Here it is. All 20 Primarchs, individually examined, honestly placed, with the reasoning shown. The caveat is real, and it is worth repeating. No ranking of this kind can be definitive. The lore is too complex, too inconsistent across sources, and too deliberately designed to resist simple hierarchy for a single correct answer to exist. What follows is the best synthesis of available evidence. It is a reading of the lore rather than a statement of objective fact. Horus Lupercal, at the peak. At maximum power, which is the chaos-empowered version the lore gives us as his final expression, he required the Emperor at full commitment to destroy. Nothing else in the setting can claim that response. Pre-corruption, he was the most complete and balanced Primarch in existence, the one the Emperor chose above all others to lead the Great Crusade, not because of any single attribute, but because of every attribute simultaneously at the highest aggregate level. His fall transformed him into something beyond his design parameters. His destruction took everything the Emperor had. Sanguinius II. The Great Angel was the most perfectly integrated individual combatant of the 20, not the best at any single attribute in isolation, but the highest combined expression of physical power, speed, precognition, psychic sensitivity, and pure fighting grace. His record includes killing the most powerful greater daemons the setting has produced multiple times, holding defensive positions long past any rational expectation, and damaging chaos-empowered Horus before dying. His death was not a defeat, Lemon Russ III. The backbreaking of Magnus, the resistance to psychic attack that makes him specifically devastating against warp-empowered opposition, the willingness to fight Horus directly during the siege, all of this places him firmly in the top tier. His specific design characteristics position him as perhaps the most important loyalist combatant against the current Daemon Primarch threat. Magnus the Red IV, with the significant caveat that his ranking is heavily context-dependent. At full psychic expression, he may be the second most dangerous individual in the setting below the Emperor. Physically, without his gifts, he is toward the lower end of the Primarch tier. The honest aggregate of both is fourth overall, acknowledging that he is perhaps the most situationally extreme of the 20. Lion L. Johnson, 5th, the finest duelist of the 20, the most technically complete individual fighter. His specific adaptive combat intelligence neutralizes advantages that other Primarchs cannot defend against. His current 41st Millennium form may be more capable than his Heresy-era self. Vulkan 6th, the physically strongest after Ferris, and the only Primarch who is a perpetual. His combination of extraordinary physical power and genuine unkillability makes him the ultimate attrition fighter. He loses fights, he has been killed repeatedly, but he never loses permanently. And in a conflict with no time limit, he wins through the simple mathematics of never stopping. Ferris Manus 7th, the single physically strongest Primarch, acknowledged by his brothers, including Vulkan. His silver hands gave him a grip and striking force that exceeded all 20. He was killed by Fulgrim at Istvan 5, evidence not of weakness, but of what it takes to end a Primarch. Another Primarch, with additional advantage in the form of a demonically enhanced blade. Rogel Dorn 8th, persistently underestimated because his famous role was defensive. The evidence for his personal combat capabilities, the sustained fighting through the siege, the mutual devastation with Perturabo at the Iron Cage, the killing of Alfarius, places him near the top of the loyalist tier, among those whose roles don't typically generate the dramatic, individual combat moments that feed the rankings debates. Jagatai Khan 9th, speed that made him effectively impossible to target, three-dimensional tactical thinking that enabled combat approaches no one else could replicate. Not the most durable or the most powerful in a sustained attrition fight, but in the kind of engagement where the first few seconds determine everything, nearly impossible to beat. Angron 10th, the most destructive individual fighter in terms of offensive output among the physically dominant tier, before his butcher's nails degraded his tactical capacity, and before his ascension made comparisons complicated. As a daemon prince, he is extraordinarily powerful, but increasingly difficult to compare to his brothers because the conversion transforms the measurement entirely. Perturabo 11th, massively underrated by the fan community and in most discussion spaces. The Iron Cage demonstrates offensive capabilities against Rogel Dorn that deserve more attention. His confrontation with Daemon Primarch Angron, his survival of Fulgrim's betrayal, and subsequent Daemon Prince ascension. A formidable and bitter genius who was used by the Imperium as a blunt instrument and responded to that treatment by becoming one of the most dangerous beings in the Eye of Terror, Mortarion 12th. The Death Lord, whose primary superpower is attrition. He does not hit harder than Angron or move faster than the Khan. He does not stop, ever. His transformation into the Daemon Prince of Nurgle has made the endurance aspect of his power something approaching absolute. He is nearly unkillable, spreads transformation through the environment simply by existing in it, and has 10,000 years of Nurgle's blessings, making what was already extraordinary into something almost geological in its patient inevitability. Guilliman 13th in his current form, substantially higher than his Heresy-era ranking would have placed him. The Emperor's Sword and the Armor of Fate have elevated a Primarch whose primary design was administrative and strategic into something genuinely formidable in personal combat as well as command. His ability to cause observable damage to Chaos God real space domains with his current armament is not something his Heresy-era self could have claimed. Fulgrim 14th, the supreme swordsman of the 20 he killed Ferrus Manus and wounded Guilliman, the two most significant kills of any Primarch against Primarch record. His Daemon Prince ascension as Slaaneish's champion has transformed him into something that reflects 10,000 years of the pursuit of perfection, taken to an extreme that the mortal Fulgrim could not have imagined. Currently active again in the 41st millennium, after a long period of relative silence within the Eye, Lorgar Aurelian 15th, the weakest Primarch in direct physical combat, consistently described as one of the smaller and less physically imposing of the 20. But the accumulated psychic and divine power of a being who has been directly cultivating chaos patronage since before the heresy began, and who has had 10,000 years of that development to compound, is substantial. He wounded Horus. He is the architect of the most significant religious transformation in human history. His power as a being is considerably greater than his physical frame suggests. Corvus, Corax, 16th. The master of being impossible to kill in the way that is strategically most relevant, not through physical invulnerability, but through the ability to never be where the lethal force is aimed. He fought his way out of Istvan V when escape should have been impossible. He impaled Lorgar and was interrupted from finishing the kill only by Curze's intervention. He departed into the Eye of Terror in 011. M31 and in subsequent years apparently became something that exists as a being of living shadow, hunting the servants of chaos in their own territory. His current status is one of the more intriguing, unresolved questions in the setting. Konrad Curze, 17th. The Night Haunter is the case against reducing everything to physical attributes. He is acknowledged as the weakest Primarch in terms of raw physical strength. He fought Lion, Guilliman, and Sanguinius simultaneously in some accounts, and held his ground through the combination of his precognition and Predator's speed and psychological warfare. He survived in an era when surviving required being extraordinary. He chose his death rather than being taken by it, which is its own kind of power over the only force that truly ends anything. Alfarius and Omegon, 18th. The alpha and omega of ambiguity in the rankings. Alfarius was killed by Guilliman, or so the records state, with the usual Alpha Legion caveat that certainty about anything involving the twin Primarchs is probably misplaced. Omegon may still be active. The Alpha Legion, as an institution, continues to operate 10,000 years after the heresy, as if their Primarch's absence is simply tactical misdirection. Whether the twins possessed individual combat power comparable to their brothers, or whether their power was always primarily expressed through their legion and their network of agents and their extraordinary capacity for deception, is a question the lore has never fully answered. Placed here because the direct combat record supports it, while acknowledging that the Alpha Legion's actual influence on the setting's events may argue for a higher placement if indirect power is measured. Section 11. The weight of what they are. There is a question underneath the question. We started by asking, how strong are the Primarchs? And we have spent a very long time answering it in every dimension we could find. Physical strength, psychic power, force of will, durability, speed, individual feats, performance against the setting's other extreme threats, comparison to the absolute ceiling represented by the Emperor himself. But there is another dimension of their strength that all of this evidence points toward, without quite naming it directly. Something that is not captured in any of the specific feats, that does not appear in any ranking, but that makes every other dimension of their power make sense in context. The Primarchs were made to carry things, not just enemy bodies, not just their weapons. They were made to carry the weight of an entire galaxy's hope for survival, to be the point of the spear that the Emperor intended to drive through 10,000 years of human suffering and emerging horror. They were made to be the beings that ordinary humans looked at and said, yes, we can folly perceive. This is worth fighting for. They were made to be the answer to every threat the universe had produced against humanity, and then to be the proof that the answer existed. Most of them failed at some version of this task, not because they were weak. Because the task was impossible at the scale it was demanded, Horus fell. Magnus destroyed the project he was trying to save. Angron was never truly given the chance to succeed. The Emperor took him from his dying companions and placed him in command of a legion and expected him to function, and the result was predictable to anyone who understood what had been done to him. Curze went to his homeworld and imposed order through terror, and the Emperor told him he had done well, and then later sent assassins because the method was too extreme, and Curze never reconciled those two messages. The ones who stayed loyal carried the weight differently. Sanguinius carried it by knowing what was coming and walking toward it anyway. Guilliman carries it now, by waking into 10,000 years of decay and choosing to rebuild rather than despair. The Lion carries it in the particular silence of someone who has been keeping secrets for so long that the keeping has become part of who they are. All of them, traitor and loyal alike, were built to hold more than human beings can hold. The tragedy of the Horus heresy is partly the tragedy of what happens when beings that strong break under pressures that are not physical at all. That is the most important thing the lore says about them. Not the backbreaking, or the lava, or the angel with the broken wings. The most important thing is that they were extraordinary, and they were still, underneath all of that, in some sense, people. With everything that being a person means the capacity for grief, for pride, for love, for the specific loneliness of standing so far above everything else that true understanding with others is rare, for the wounds that other people leave in you, regardless of how strong your body is. The Primarchs are the answer to how strong can something be. And they are also the argument that strength is not enough. Closing. We started with a simple question and arrived somewhere considerably more complex, which is exactly where Warhammer 40K takes you every time you follow any of its threads to their end. The Primarchs are physically impossible. They can lift things that physics says cannot be lifted. They can survive things that should kill them many times over. They can think faster than human minds can follow, feel battlefield dynamics across scales that human perception cannot hold, project their will outward in ways that change the behavior of everyone around them. Their deaths echo for 10,000 years in the genetics of their sons. Their choices, made in moments of crisis during a civil war that ended in 014 M31, are still shaping events in M42. They are the ceiling of mortal power in one of the most densely imagined science fiction universes ever created, and even they have a ceiling above them, and above that ceiling sits a ceiling, and at the very top of all of it are forces so immense and so ancient that the word powerful stops having useful meaning. That is, Warhammer 40K. Everything is extraordinary and nothing is safe, and the grimdark is not a metaphor. It is the honest description of a universe that is trying to kill everything that lives in it, including everything that is strong enough to fight back. If you made it this far, drop a comment. Tell me who your Primarch is, where you are watching from, what the time is where you sit, every single country and time zone. I want to see all of them. And if you subscribed somewhere in the last several hours of this, thank you. There is more like this ahead. For the Emperor, and for Sanguinius. All information in this script is drawn from Black Library canonical sources, including the Horus Heresy novel series, Siege of Terra novel series, Dark Imperium era novels, official Warhammer 40,000 Codex materials, the Warhammer 40,000 and Horus Heresy wikis and lexiconum. Speculation is labeled where present. For Q40K, Section 12, the tragedy encoded in their design. There is something the lore keeps returning to that goes beyond power rankings and combat records. Something that the writers across decades of Black Library fiction keep finding their way back to whenever they are telling the most honest stories about the Primarchs. It is the design contradiction at the heart of what they are. They were made to be perfect. That word perfect appears constantly in descriptions of the Primarch project. The Emperor wanted perfect generals, perfect warriors, perfect statesmen. He wanted beings who combined the highest levels of physical capability with the deepest intellectual gifts, with the strongest moral foundations. He wanted sons who embodied every virtue the species was capable of producing. And then he scattered them across the galaxy as infants, alone, to be shaped by worlds that were often brutal and traumatic, and shaped by forces entirely outside the Emperor's control. Angron landed on Nuceria and was enslaved. The slavers who found him hammered psychosurgical cortical implants into his skull, the butcher's nails, to make him a more effective gladiator, to suppress his natural reluctance to kill, to drive him through pain and aggression toward the performance they were paying to see. The Emperor found him years later, fighting a final battle alongside the gladiators who had become his family, people he loved, the only people who had ever treated him with anything approaching dignity. He was about to die beside them, and the Emperor teleported him away. Just him, left his companions to die. The logic was presumably that retrieving Angron was the priority, that the gladiators' deaths were individually meaningless against the scale of the Great Crusade. That sentiment could not govern the decisions of someone trying to save the human species. All of this is probably true, and none of it excuses what it did to Angron, who spent the rest of his life with the butcher's nails, slowly destroying his brain, leading a legion he had never asked for. In the service of a father he could not forgive, unable to grieve properly because the implants were eating the parts of his brain where grief lived, he did not choose chaos. Chaos found a man who was already broken and offered him the one thing the Emperor never had, an end. Konrad Curze the Night Haunter landed on Nostromo, a hive world of almost total darkness where crime had consumed every level of society and ordinary humans lived in the kind of grinding, hopeless misery that had forgotten it was misery because misery was all it had ever known. The infant Primarch grew up alone in that darkness, developing precognitive visions that showed him the future in terrible detail, not just his own future, but the future of everyone around him, the cascades of consequence that flowed from every action. He used this gift to understand that the only way to change Nostromo was through terror. He began killing criminals. He displayed their bodies publicly, and it worked. Crime dropped. People began to feel something that might have been safety. The Emperor found him and told him he had done well, that the method was right, that the Night Lords would embody this principle of order through terror on a galactic scale. And then, later, the Emperor declared that the Night Lords' methods were unacceptable and that Curze needed to be brought to heel. Curze, who had only ever done what the Emperor praised him for, who had taken the lesson the Emperor gave him on Nostromo and applied it faithfully across his entire career, understood this as confirmation of the one thing his precognition had always shown him, that there was no justice, only power, and power used him and discarded him as it chose. He allowed himself to be killed. He chose the moment, chose to not resist, let the Calidus assassin Machen take him, because his precognition had always shown him his death, and he had decided that the one act of agency remaining to him was to choose not to fight it. If the Emperor was right, and there was meaning in the universe, then Curze's death at an assassin's hand was justice deserved. If Curze was right, and there was no justice, then the Emperor was simply having him killed because it was convenient, which proved his point. Either way, he could finally stop. Magnus. The tragedy of Magnus is perhaps the most complete and the most operatic. He wanted knowledge. That was it. That was the whole of his motivation for everything he did. He wanted to understand the warp, to understand psychic power, to understand the nature of the universe he found himself in. Not for power, not for conquest, for understanding. The Imperium's response, the Council of Nicaea, the prohibition on sorcery, the insistence that knowledge of certain kinds was forbidden, was not merely impractical for a mind like his. It was a kind of violence. Being told that there are questions you are not permitted to ask is, for a mind built around the pursuit of knowledge, a form of mutilation. He kept studying anyway, because he could not stop. And in his studying, he made a bargain with Tzeentch that he did not fully understand accepted help, that he thought was freely given, not understanding that nothing the Changer of Ways offers is freely given. The flesh change that had been destroying his legion was cured. The cure cost him more than he knew. When he saw Horus's corruption coming and tried to warn his father, tried to prevent the catastrophe that eventually killed hundreds of millions of people across the galaxy, he was told it was his fault for using the method he used. Not thank you for the warning. Not let us address the information. Your method was wrong, and we are going to punish you for it. He accepted the punishment because he believed he deserved it. He told his sons to stand down. He was prepared to be arrested and brought before the Emperor in chains. Leman Russ came to destroy him instead. Even then, even being attacked by his brother's entire legion in full force, Magnus held his sons back for as long as he could, told them not to fight, tried to absorb the destruction as the price of his mistakes. He only took the field when watching his sons die around him became more than he could endure. He fought. Russ broke him. He fled. He spent the next 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror being remade by Tzeentch because there was nowhere else to go. These stories, Angron, Curze, Magnus, are the stories of beings who were extraordinary and were also victims. Not victims in ways that excuse their choices, not victims in ways that make them sympathetic beyond all criticism, but victims in ways that make the Horus Heresy something more than a straightforward story about traitors and loyalists. Something more complicated and more honest about the nature of catastrophe. Power, at any scale, does not prevent suffering. It does not prevent being used. It does not prevent being abandoned. It does not prevent the compounding of small bad choices into cascades of irreversible consequence. The Primarchs are the most powerful beings the human species has ever produced, and the most powerful among them were also broken in ways that no one tried to fix, because no one believed that beings of their capability could need fixing. That is the tragedy encoded in their design, and it is the thing that makes the lore worth reading, beyond all the lore details and the power rankings and the specific feats. Section 13. The weapons they carried, and what those weapons say. An examination of Primarch strength would not be complete without looking at the instruments they fought with, because the weapons a Primarch uses say something specific about the scale of force they were regularly applying, and some of the most interesting power information in the lore comes embedded in descriptions of their armaments. Ferrus Manus's Forgebreaker is the clearest example. This was a thunder hammer of extraordinary construction, built by Fulgrim for his brother as a gift, an act of friendship and craft that takes on terrible irony given what Fulgrim eventually did. The hammer was specifically noted as requiring Primarch-level strength to wield effectively in combat. Not desirable, not recommended required. A standard Space Marine attempting to use Forgebreaker as an actual weapon rather than a static exhibit piece would find it functionally useless in combat, too heavy to swing with the speed and precision that fighting demands. Only a Primarch's strength made it a weapon rather than a very impressive obstacle. When Fulgrim claimed Forgebreaker as a trophy after killing Ferrus, he took it not for his own use. Fulgrim was a blade fighter, not a hammerman, but as a symbol. It eventually passed to Perturabo, who was specifically identified as among the Primarchs with sufficient physical capability to actually fight with it. In a list of 20 beings, who are all objectively superhuman, being singled out as having the raw strength to swing this particular hammer is a meaningful distinction. Mjolnir, Leman Russ's Frostblade, was a weapon built for his specific fighting style, not the heaviest weapon among the 20, but one whose properties interacted specifically with the anti-psychic qualities Russ possessed. The accounts of it cutting through other Primarchs' armor suggest a blade quality that went beyond simple material composition. Whether this was anti-daemonic properties, psychic nullfield embedded in the blade's construction, or simply the natural consequence of something swung by Lemon Russ. The results were the same. Sanguinius carried the Spear of Telesto, a weapon of considerable power that transmitted his own psychic gifts through its strikes, and later, at the siege, fought with the Spear of Eternity, described as a weapon of divine construction suitable for the most significant battle of his life. His wings, which were not technically weapons but functioned as them, are worth noting because the leading edges of a fully spread set of wings, belonging to a being of Sanguinius's mass, brought down in a strike, would carry force roughly equivalent to a vehicle collision. He used them this way deliberately, folded for penetration, spread for clearing space. The Doom of Malantai, the Emperor's Sword, the Hand of Dominion, the weapons associated with Guilliman in his current era, are notable not just for their power but for what they represent. The Emperor's Sword carries a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic essence, which means that, in wielding it, Guilliman has access to a dimension of power that was never part of his original design. The Primarch of the Ultramarines was not built as a frontline champion. He was built as the finest general in human history. The fact that his current armament makes him genuinely formidable in personal combat against the setting's most extreme threats is a deliberate narrative choice the Imperium needs its leader to be able to fight, as well as command. In an era when command and fighting are happening in the same place simultaneously, the black blade that Angron carried as a Daemon Prince and its replacement, Spine-Grinder, the enormous chain axe crafted on the Traitor Forge world of Perjax and then used to kill the craftsman who made it, because Angron is nothing if not consistent, says something about what Khornate aesthetic preferences produce at Primarch scale. Massive, brutal, loud, absolutely committed to the destruction of whatever it is aimed at. There is something almost honest about weapons that don't pretend to be anything other than what they are. The Lion carried the Lion Sword during the Heresy, a weapon that is now in the hands of Cypher, the mysterious fallen Dark Angel who has evaded capture for 10,000 years and seems to appear whenever the narrative requires a complication. In the current era, the Lion carries the Emperor's shield and new blades appropriate to his current form. The Emperor's shield is the counterpart to Guilliman's Emperor's Sword, where the sword is an offensive divine weapon. The shield carries protective properties that extend beyond its physical function. The symbolism of the two returned loyalist Primarchs carrying sword and shield as matched divine artifacts is presumably not accidental. Section 14, the two lost Primarchs, and what their absence says. Any complete accounting of the 20 Primarchs must acknowledge the two who are not discussed, because their absence is itself a statement about Primarch-level power and what happens when it goes wrong, in ways that cannot be publicly acknowledged. The 2nd and the 11th Legions are erased from Imperial records. Their names are not known, their identities are not recorded, their histories are buried so completely that even the most comprehensive Imperial archives contain only the absence where they should be. This is not accidental destruction of records. It is deliberate and systematic expungement, carried out with such thoroughness that even the Space Marine chapters descended from those legions, if any existed, have been folded into successor chapters, whose true heritage is hidden. The lore has never revealed what they did. The speculation is extensive. The most commonly held theories within the fan community involve failures so catastrophic, mass extinction of human populations, corruption so complete that the legions themselves had to be destroyed, betrayals so early in the Great Crusade that even the precedent of their existence had to be removed, that simply punishing the Primarchs was insufficient. The Emperor had to unmake them from history. This tells you something important about power at Primarch scale. The Emperor was willing to erase the existence of two of his own sons, two of his greatest creations, rather than allow the knowledge of what they had done to persist. Whatever they did, it was bad enough that the cure had to include amnesia, not just for the Imperium at large, but for the culture of the Space Marines, who would be building their entire identity on the memory of their Primarchs as heroic forebears. There are a few Primarchs who seem to know. Lorgar appears to, in some accounts. The Lion seems to carry knowledge of things that are not recorded. Guilliman, in his role as Lord Commander, presumably has access to the most complete records the Imperium possesses, which might or might not include the truth. But none of them are saying. The lost Primarchs are the reminder that Primarch power is not inherently a positive force. It is a force that the Emperor designed to serve specific purposes, and that, absent those purposes or directed against them, is one of the most dangerous things the setting has ever produced. 2 of the 20 did something with that power that was apparently worse than everything the traitors accomplished during the Horus Heresy, or at least something that required a more thorough response. The Heresy's traitors are at least remembered, if damned. The lost Primarchs are simply gone. Section 15. The Great Crusade, when they were at their best. There is a period in the Warhammer timeline that the lore always treats with a particular kind of nostalgic weight: the Great Crusade, the centuries of expansion and reunification before the heresy, when the Emperor's sons were active and united, and pointed at humanity's external threats rather than at each other. This is the era when Primarch power operated at its most straightforward expression, not corrupted by chaos, not diminished by tragedy, not carrying 10,000 years of grief, just 20 extraordinary beings doing the thing they were designed for. The Primarchs during the Crusade conquered worlds. Not supervised the conquering of worlds, they personally led assaults on civilizations that had developed independently for centuries or millennia, often with technologies and military capabilities that would have destroyed any ordinary army. They fought the elder of alien species who had been fighting wars before humanity existed. They solved problems that defied conventional military solution through the specific combination of their personal power and their ability to inspire the forces around them. The triumph of Ullanor, the great gathering of the Primarchs, in celebration of their victory over the Orc Empire that had posed the most serious galactic threat of that era, is described in the lore as one of the few occasions when most of the 20 were in the same place simultaneously, before the heresy began to peel them apart. The accounts of that gathering describe something that ordinary human perception struggled to process: 20 beings of extraordinary individual presence in the same space, each radiating their specific character and power. The accumulated psychic weight of their warp signatures pressing on every observer in ways that made even space marines feel small. Horus was named War Master at that gathering. The celebration was also the last time the Great Crusade felt like it was going to work, the last moment before the shadow of the heresy began to fall over everything. Looking back from the knowledge of what came after, the triumph of Ullanor reads as the highest point before the long fall, the moment when everything was as good as it was ever going to be. The individual Primarchs' records during the Crusade are extraordinary, even by the standards we have established in this discussion. Guilliman built an empire. Horus conquered more worlds and faster than any other legion. Sanguinius's Blood Angels turned from berserkers into warriors of genuine nobility through their Primarch's influence. Russ served as the Emperor's executioner, sent to punish the unruly and the dangerous, including, in the case of the World Eater's rampage, being sent to censure Angron, a mission he approached with the specific combination of bluntness and determination that defined everything he did. Magnus built a civilization of psychic knowledge on Prospero. Perturabo broke fortifications that everyone else said were unbreakable, was thanked with another fortification to break, and developed the resentment that would eventually contribute to his fall, with the quiet accumulation of a man who was always being sent where things were worst, and never being recognized for it afterward. The Crusade era is when you can see most clearly why the Emperor made the choices he made. Each of the 20 was genuinely extraordinary. Each of them, in their domain, was irreplaceable. The tragedy is not that the design was flawed. The tragedy is that the design was too good at producing specific kinds of excellence and not good enough at producing the psychological resilience that would have been required to keep that excellence directed at the right targets across the full span of human experience. Section 16. The scale of what they built and what they destroyed. There is a final dimension of Primarch power that transcends personal combat entirely and addresses the question from a civilizational scale rather than an individual one. Because the most significant expression of Primarch strength is not any single feat of physical prowess impressive as those feats are, but the fact that these beings reshaped human history across 10 millennia. Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes, the document that has governed Space Marine doctrine for 10,000 years. Think about what that means. A set of operational guidelines, organizational principles, and philosophical frameworks written by a single being in the immediate aftermath of the heresy, still being followed with near religious devotion by thousands of chapters across the galaxy 10 millennia later. The Codex Astartes is not just a tactical document, it is a civilizational institution. The fact that Guilliman's thinking was sufficiently sound, that it has sustained operational relevance across 10,000 years of changing warfare and technology and threat landscapes, is a demonstration of intellectual power that dwarfs any of the physical feats in this discussion. Horus orchestrated the heresy. This is not said to praise him for it, but the scope of what he achieved in terms of pure manipulation, convincing fully half of the Primarchs to turn against the Emperor, creating the conditions for the most destructive war in human history, managing the specific individual approaches required to corrupt beings, as different as Magnus and Angron and Mortarion and Fulgrim, represents intelligence and political skill, operating at a scale that defies ordinary categorization. The heresy was not a military campaign that happened to divide the legions. It was a masterwork of psychic and psychological manipulation that Horus executed with support from the chaos gods, but personal genius as the foundation. Sanguinius created the Blood Angels Legion's culture, literally created it, transformed a legion that had been borderline feral before his arrival into something that valued beauty and art alongside warfare, that produced painters and musicians among its warriors, that treated compassion as a martial virtue rather than a weakness. That culture has persisted for 10,000 years after his death. The black rage that afflicts his sons is the most terrible consequence of his ending. But the warmth and the beauty that they carry, the paradox of warriors who create as well as destroy that came from him, from who he chose to be and the specific love he chose to express through his leadership. Magnus's search for knowledge, however it ended, produced the most comprehensive body of psychic theory that humanity has ever created. Prospero's great library, the Thousand Suns cataloging of the warp's nature, the theoretical frameworks that Magnus developed, all of this was destroyed in the burning of Prospero, but its existence tells you something about what Primarch-level intellect applied to a single subject over decades can produce. He was 30 years into a research program that might have lasted centuries. We do not know what he would have found. Perturabo's fortifications still stand. On planets across the galaxy, structures that the Iron Warriors built under his direct instruction have survived 10,000 years of warfare, environmental change, and the general entropy that destroys most things eventually. The iron cage, the elaborate trap he designed specifically for Rogel Dorn, was described in terms of engineering complexity that exceeded anything the Imperium's military engineers could replicate without Perturabo's direct involvement. A Primarch expressed as a siege engineer rather than a fighter produced something genuinely extraordinary, which makes the tragedy of his career always being sent to the worst conflicts, always doing the hardest work, never being recognized for it, all the more pointed. These are civilizational expressions of Primarch strength. The buildings, the doctrines, the cultural transformations, the intellectual frameworks, the wars won and wars started, these persist in ways that no amount of physical strength can match, because they are changes made at the level where societies and species live, rather than at the level where individual combatants meet. The Primarchs were made to be the strongest warriors the human species could produce. What they actually became was the most consequential beings in human history. Some of them used that consequence well, some of them used it terribly. All of them left marks on the galaxy that are still legible 10,000 years later, in the cultures of the chapters that carry their gene seed, in the wars that are being fought across the 41st millennium, in the very structure of the Imperium of Man, and the nature of the conflict against chaos that defines everything humanity currently faces. That is the final answer to how strong they are, not in megatons, or in tons lifted, or in greater daemons killed. In the fact that 10,000 years have passed, and the galaxy is still shaped by what they chose. That is the complete discussion of Primarch strength in Warhammer 40K. The physical scale, the psychic fire, the force of will, the specific feats, the tragedies and the triumphs, and the civilizational weight of what beings at this level of power leave behind when they pass through history. If you have watched or listened to this entire thing, Thank you genuinely. This is the kind of deep lore dive that only exists because there is an audience willing to sit with it. Drop a comment, subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one. For the Emperor, for Sanguinius, for the wolf time to come. Section 17. The Primarchs against each other. The complete duel record. One of the richest sources of concrete information about relative Primarch power levels comes from the documented engagements between them across the Horus Heresy. When two beings of this caliber fight each other, the outcomes are among the most carefully debated data points in all of Warhammer lore. Let us go through every significant Primarch versus Primarch engagement in the record, because the pattern of who wins, who loses, and under what circumstances tells a more honest story than any abstract ranking can. Lemon Russ versus Magnus the Red at Prospero. Outcome. Russ wins definitively, breaking Magnus's back and driving him from the field. Context. Magnus had augmented himself with sorcery. Russ had a heart punctured mid-fight and continued. The anti-psychic resistance Russ apparently carries as a design characteristic neutralized Magnus's primary advantage and forced the confrontation into the physical dimension where Russ was decisively superior. The Lion versus Leman Russ on Dulan. One of the most debated engagements in the entire heresy, because the Space Wolves and Dark Angels have been arguing about its outcome for 10,000 years, and the canonical sources are frustratingly ambiguous. The most honest reading. The Lion had the better of it at the time. Both sides' subordinates intervened to stop the fight from killing either Primarch. Russ was in a more dangerous position when pulled away. Neither side accepts this reading fully, which is arguably the point Games Workshop has built a 10,000-year argument into the lore on purpose, and the ambiguity is the feature rather than the bug. Fulgrim versus Ferrus Manus at Istvan 5. Outcome. Fulgrim kills Ferrus, decapitating him. Context. This is the most significant Primarch death in the entire Horus Heresy, and its context is specific. Fulgrim was already in the early stages of demonic possession from the sword he carried, which had been slowly corrupting him. The fight was preceded by Fulgrim's attempt to persuade Ferrus to join the traitors, an appeal Ferrus rejected so completely that Fulgrim's corrupted pride snapped. The killing blow was described as something Fulgrim did not entirely choose, the daemon in the blade expressing itself through the Primarch. This does not mean Fulgrim was not dangerous or capable of killing his brother. It means the context of the fight, the corruption, the emotional extremity, the specific moment contributed to the outcome in ways that make a clean ranking comparison difficult. The aftermath was devastating for Fulgrim. He was haunted by what he had done, his former self raging against the corruption that had used him. This guilt became the leverage the daemon used to complete its possession, taking his body while Fulgrim's own consciousness was imprisoned within it. The price of killing his closest brother was losing himself entirely. Fulgrim versus Guilliman at the Battle of Thessaly. Outcome. Guilliman, mortally wounded, placed in stasis. Context. Fulgrim was, by this point, either fully possessed or a daemon prince. The exact transition point is debated and carried a chaos-tainted blade with specific metaphysical properties. This was not a straightforward physical fight. Fulgrim's ability to land the wound he landed tells you something about what a daemon prince of Slaanesh can do to a Primarch in their prime. But the chaos-tainted blade, doing metaphysical rather than purely physical damage, means the outcome doesn't straightforwardly translate to Guilliman being physically less capable than Fulgrim. Rogel Dorn versus Alfarius at the Battle of Pluto. Outcome. Alfarius killed, cleaved in two. Context. This is significant partly because Alfarius apparently allowed it. The Alpha Legion Primarch's precognitive and manipulative gifts mean that everything they do has layers of deliberate intent. Was Alfarius genuinely defeated? Did he choose the outcome? Is the Alfarius who died actually Alfarius or Omegon? The Alpha Legion made these questions their whole identity, and they remain unresolved. What the record shows is that Dorn had the physical and tactical capability to kill a Primarch in direct combat when the opportunity presented itself. The Lion versus Konrad Curze, multiple engagements. Their conflict was not a single fight, but a running campaign throughout the Thramas Crusade and beyond. The Lion hunted Curze. Curze hid. The Lion eventually cornered him, and they fought directly. The Lion won, eventually. Curze's survival through the extended campaign relied on his speed and stealth and psychological manipulation, rather than his ability to defeat the lion in open combat, which is itself an acknowledgement that, in a fair fight, the lion was the superior combatant. Curze survived not by being stronger, but by never fighting fair. The lion's engagement with Curze, specifically in the context of the Invincible Reason the Dark Angel's flagship, where Curze was trapped for an extended period, is one of the more narratively interesting Primarch conflicts because it was a hunt rather than a battle. Two beings of extraordinary capability, one pursuing and one evading, in a closed environment. The lion could not simply overwhelm Curze through force, because Curze was not engaging in force-on-force combat. He was being a predator in a ship that he understood better than he was supposed to. The lion was being systematic and patient and methodical. The hunt lasted weeks. Corax versus Lorgar at the Drop Site Massacre. Outcome: Corax impales Lorgar. Curze intervenes before the kill. Context: this is a significant data point because it shows Corax, who is not in the top tier of raw physical power among the 20, being on the winning side of a fight with Lorgar until an external factor changed it. It says something about Corax's combat effectiveness in the specific engagement style he favors, the fast strike, the precise blow, making the most of a moment of opportunity. Lorgar's survival of this engagement required Curze's intervention, which means, in that moment, at that place, Corax was the more dangerous combatant. Perturabo versus Angron, Daemon Prince, during the Heresy. Outcome: Perturabo controlled the outcome sufficiently to redirect Angron from a position he needed cleared. The specifics are not fully detailed in all sources, but the fact of a non-Chaos Ascended Primarch, at that point dealing with a freshly ascended Daemon Primarch, effectively enough to influence the situation, is notable. Perturabo was always underestimated, because his gifts were expressed in engineering and strategy, rather than personal combat spectacle. But he was still a Primarch, and his combat record reflects that. The broader pattern across all these engagements is instructive. Physical dominance matters, but is not determinative. Environmental and tactical factors change outcomes. Psychic capabilities shift the calculus significantly. Motivation: whether a Primarch is genuinely committed to winning or is operating under constraints that prevent full commitment, shapes what we can conclude from any given result. And the specific combinations of traits matter enormously. Russ's anti-psychic design made him dangerous to Magnus in ways he would not have been dangerous to Dorn. The lion's specific adaptive combat intelligence made him dangerous to Curze in ways it would not have made him specifically dangerous to Angron. The record of direct Primarch combat in the lore is not a straightforward power table. It is a complex set of interactions where design, circumstance, motivation, and luck all contribute to outcomes that cannot be reduced to a single number. What it consistently shows is that every engagement between Primarchs involves stakes that no ordinary combat can match, and that the aftermath of those engagements echoes through the setting in ways that outlast the combatants themselves. Section 18. The legacy of each Primarch in their successors. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of Primarch power is the way it persists through the chapters that carry their gene seed. Each Primarch's specific gifts, their particular emphases, their characteristic strengths and weaknesses. These are partially transmitted biologically through the gene seed and partially transmitted culturally through the traditions their legions developed under their influence. 10,000 years later, those transmissions are still visible. The Blood Angels carry Sanguinius's beauty, his love of art and creation alongside warfare, and his specific tragedy, the Black Rage and the Red Thirst. The Black Rage means that in their most extreme moments of battle fury, Blood Angels do not simply fight as well as they can. They fight as Sanguinius fought in his final moments, with the full emotional intensity of a being who knows they are about to die and chooses to make the death mean something. This makes them extraordinarily dangerous in close combat, particularly as the rage deepens. It also means they are burning through their warriors' sanity with every deployment, which is why the Death Company exists, the warriors already in the grip of the rage, committed to the most desperate assaults because they are already lost and might as well spend their deaths usefully. The Space Wolves carry Russ's fundamental distrust of anything that smells like sorcery, his loyalty above all value system, his celebration of martial excellence within a culture that has room for boasting and feasting, as well as fighting. They are also marked by his literal genetic quirks. Space Wolves warriors have a higher incidence of the Canis Helix mutation than almost any other chapter has for equivalent gene seed idiosyncrasies, producing the Wolfen, warriors who transform partially into something ancient and wolf-like when the strain becomes too great. This is Russ's homeworld and his specific biological heritage, expressing itself through 10,000 years of imperfect replication. The Iron Hands carry Ferrus Manus's response to his own death, not the man himself, who had no chance to shape this, but the Legion's collective psychological response to losing him at Istvan V. The Iron Hands decided, in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, that flesh was weakness, that emotion was weakness, that the thing that had made them vulnerable, caring about each other, being affected by loss, was something to be excised along with the biological matter it lived in. They began replacing their bodies with machinery, with a systematic commitment that exceeded even the Adeptus Mechanicus's usual enthusiasm for cybernetics. 10,000 years later, Iron Hands warriors replace working biological components with machine parts as a matter of philosophy rather than necessity. The hand specifically is often the first replacement made, as a deliberate echo of Ferrus and as a statement about what the chapter believes about the relationship between biological matter and strength. The obsession is Ferrus's legacy, transmitted not through his genetics but through the trauma of his absence. The Dark Angels carry the Lion's secrecy. Every aspect of how they operate the inner circles, the Deathwing and the Ravenwing, the centuries-long hunt for the fallen, the absolute priority given to preventing any knowledge of the betrayal from spreading beyond their own ranks. This is the Lion, expressed through an institution. His instinct for compartmentalization, for keeping different people informed of different things, for managing information as carefully as he managed his Legion's tactical disposition, all of it is now baked into the chapter's culture to such a degree that Dark Angel's warriors may not fully understand why they operate the way they do. The reason is 10,000 years old and is walking around in the 41st millennium, making new messes. The Ultramarines carry Guilliman's belief that war should be waged toward a goal, that the point of the fighting is what comes after, that building something worth fighting for matters as much as the fighting itself. The Codex Astartes, the guidelines, the doctrines, the entire organizational philosophy that Guilliman wrote is the Ultramarines. In the same way, the Iron Hands' cybernetic philosophy is Ferrus's grief. Not identical, not unchanged across 10,000 years, but traceable back to the specific mind and the specific values that produced it. And the Imperial Fists carry Dorn's absolute refusal to yield. The Black Templars, one of the most aggressive and committed successor chapters, warriors who take crusades as a way of life, because a fortress monastery would feel like surrender, are, in some respects, an expression of the Imperial Fist's gene seed taken to one of its natural extremes. The Imperial Fists themselves are known for an unusual trait. They can feel pain more intensely than most Space Marines, a quirk of their gene seed that should be a weakness, but has been incorporated into their culture as a point of pride. They carry a device called the Pain Glove, specifically to ensure their warriors can endure anything. Dorn's absolute stubbornness, his refusal to break, lives in his son's relationship with pain. The traitor Primarchs' legacies are equally visible, but take different forms. The World Eater's inheritance from Angron is the Butcher's nails, not his individual implants, which were specific to him, but the principle of them, the voluntary surgical commitment to fury over reason, the choosing of destruction as an end in itself. Angron's tragedy reproduced in 1,000 warriors who hammered similar devices into their own skulls, in an attempt to be more like the Primarch, who hated having them. The word-bearers carry Lorgar's need for faith, his absolute conviction that devotion is the highest expression of sentient being. They are the most theologically sophisticated Chaos Space Marine Legion, the one that treats the Chaos Gods as genuinely worthy of worship, rather than simply useful powers to exploit. This is what Lorgar was looking for throughout his entire life, a god actually worth serving. He found 4 of them. Whether this represents vindication or the most terrible possible fulfillment of a need depends entirely on how you feel about the Chaos Gods. The Death Guard carry Mortarian's specific form of endurance, his willingness to absorb punishment that would break anything else, his philosophy that strength comes from suffering. Nurgle's gifts, the plagues, the corrupted biology, the zombie-like persistence, are a terrible parody of Mortarian's actual values, which were about earning resilience through difficulty rather than having it gifted through corruption. But the shape of those values, the commitment to carrying on, regardless of what the environment does to you, is still visible underneath the rot. The Thousand Sons carry Magnus's knowledge hunger, his conviction that understanding is worth any cost. Siege has ensured that many of them now exist as dust within their own armor. The rubric that was meant to solve the flesh change instead turned most of the Legion into animated suits of armor, containing the souls of warriors who can neither fully live nor die, which is perhaps the most pointed possible cosmic joke about the price of the kind of knowledge Magnus pursued. But the Thousand Sons who remain flesh still search, still reach into the warp for what they need, still believe, as their Primarch believed, that there is something worth finding. Section 19. What the Primarchs mean to the people who follow them. There is a dimension of Primarch power that operates entirely through other people, through the way their presence, their legacy, and the specific qualities encoded in their gene seed affect the Space Marines who carry their blood. A Space Marine going into battle for the Emperor is fighting for an abstraction, for an ideal, for a civilization. This is noble, and this is sufficient for most purposes. But a Space Marine going into battle alongside a Primarch, or fighting under the inspiration of one, is fighting for something that is simultaneously abstract and completely personal. The father is not a metaphor to them. The genetic bond is real in their biology. When Sanguinius appeared on a wall during the siege, and his sons saw him there, what they felt was not simply the morale boost of seeing a capable commander. It was something closer to an alarm going off in their cells that said, "This is the one. This is why you were made. This is the person your existence was designed to serve." This is also why Primarch deaths hit their legions with disproportionate weight. Ferrus Manus was killed at Istvan V, and the Iron Hand's response was not strategic grief, the careful processing of a loss within the context of an ongoing war. It was a psychological rupture that left marks on every aspect of the chapter's culture for 10,000 years. Sanguinius died on the vengeful spirit, and his death was literally transmitted through the gene seed into a heritable neurological condition that still kills Blood Angel's warriors in the 41st millennium. The Primarchs are not simply commanders whose loss requires replacement. They are integral to the biological and psychological identity of the organisms who carry their genetics. This is a dimension of power that is easy to underestimate because it is not expressed in combat statistics or lifting capacity. But consider, a Primarch standing on a wall during the defense of the most important city in human history is not contributing just the force of their personal combat ability to that defense. They are contributing the specific and irreplaceable thing they do to the morale of every Space Marine in their genetic line, which may number tens of thousands of warriors in that moment. They are making those warriors fight at a level that even those warriors are not normally capable of sustaining. The value of that to the defense of a fortification under sustained assault is difficult to quantify, but clearly enormous. It is also why the return of Guilliman in the 41st millennium is not simply the addition of one powerful combatant to the Imperial cause. It is the return of something that was absent from the Ultramarines and their successors. For 10,000 years, the living source of the genetic and cultural identity that every Ultramarine carries. The chapters descended from Guilliman's gene seed have been fighting as orphans for 100 centuries. He is back. Something in them knows it, in ways that probably cannot be fully articulated, and that knowledge produces effects that no strategic analysis of his personal combat capability can capture. The same principle applies to the Lion and the Dark Angels. The same principle will apply to Russ, if and when the wolf time comes, and he returns from whatever he is doing in the depths of the Eye of Terror. And on the traitor's side, the same principle is why the presence of Angron or Mortarion or Magnus on a battlefield produces a specific kind of dread in Space Marines of their genetic lineage, not just fear of a powerful enemy, but something that touches the bone-deep genetic memory of who these beings are and what they represent. the Primarchs' power is not contained in their bodies. It extends through everyone who carries their blood. And since Space Marine chapters carry that blood across 10,000 years and across thousands of warriors, the Primarchs are not 20 individual beings with extraordinary capabilities. They are each the living heart of a lineage, and the power of the lineage is part of their power. Closing the answer, finally, complete. Section 20. The Primarchs, and the question of what they were really for. The Emperor created them as generals. That is the official position, the one preserved in the Lectitio Divinitatis and the various hagiographies that the Imperium has produced over 10,000 years. They were made to lead the Great Crusade, to be the generals and proconsuls of a galaxy-spanning military project, to bring a scattered, suffering humanity back into unity under the Emperor's secular truth. This is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far. The Emperor built 20 beings of extraordinary power, each embodying a different aspect of human potential at its absolute peak, using his own genetics as the foundation and warp power as the enhancement. He then scattered them not deliberately. The Chaos Gods did that to worlds across the galaxy, worlds that would shape them in ways he could not control. He found them one by one and gave them command of the armies built from their own genetic material and pointed all of them at the same task. And then Horus fell, and then 9 others fell. And then the Emperor was placed on the Golden Throne. The question that the lore has been quietly asking across decades of novels and source books and games is whether the catastrophe was inevitable, whether something about the design contained the seeds of its own destruction, whether 20 beings of extraordinary power, each with a specific domain of excellence and a specific vulnerability shaped by the world they grew up on, could have been pointed at a single task indefinitely, without the tensions between them eventually producing exactly what happened. The answer the lore seems to give is, maybe not inevitable, but close. The Chaos Gods worked to ensure it. The specific vulnerabilities of each Primarch, Horus's pride, Magnus's hunger for knowledge, Angron's grief, Lorgar's need for faith, Curze's nihilism, Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection, these were not random. They were qualities that the Chaos Gods had identified and cultivated, and waited decades to exploit. The ruinous powers are patient in ways that mortal beings cannot quite comprehend, because they exist outside of time as mortals experience it. And what looks from inside, like a sudden catastrophe, looks from outside, like the careful unfolding of a plan, 10,000 years in the making. But the vulnerabilities had to be there for the Chaos Gods to exploit. And they were there because the Emperor, for all his extraordinary capabilities, was building his sons in the dark literally, in gene laboratories under the Himalayan mountains, using arcane methods that no other being has replicated since, and some of what he built into them, he may not have fully understood. The warp power that made them superhuman also made them susceptible to the Chaos Gods, who are made of warp power. The specific excellences of each Primarch also created specific blind spots. The very qualities that made Horus the finest general humanity ever produced made him exactly the right target for a corruption that worked through pride and ambition and the sincere belief that he could do better. This is what the Primarchs were really for, beyond the official explanation. They were the Emperor's greatest experiment in the question of what human potential could become, and the answer the experiment produced was extraordinary and fragile in ways that extraordinary things often are. The most extreme expressions of human virtue are also often the most extreme expressions of human vulnerability. Sanguinius's love made his sons curse carriers. Magnus's knowledge hunger made him pray for Tsainch. Angron's capacity for loyalty, the quality that made him protect his gladiator companions with everything he had, became the weapon the Emperor used against him without understanding or caring about the cost. The Primarchs were made to be strong. They became the measure of how far that strength could reach, and also the proof that strength, at any scale, cannot substitute for wisdom about what the strength is for. Section 21. The current war, and what comes next. The 41st millennium is in the middle of its greatest crisis since the Horus Heresy. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, has split the galaxy across its width, a permanent tear in reality through which the warp bleeds into the material universe continuously. The Noctis Eterna followed its opening, a period of warp darkness that cut off the Astronomicon and left half the galaxy blind for an unknown duration. The Imperium of Man has been cut into two halves, and the half on the far side of the rift, the Imperium Nihilus, has been fighting in isolation without the full support of Terra. In this context, the return of the Primarchs is not simply a narrative convenience, it is a structural necessity. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is not capable, in its current form, of surviving what is being asked of it. The bureaucratic calcification that Guilliman found so devastating when he woke, the religious superstition that has replaced the Emperor's materialist, imperial truth, the inability to adapt, the corruption at every level. None of this would have been tolerable to the Emperor, or to the Primarchs who built the Imperium's foundations. But it has been running for 10,000 years, and it is the only government humanity's most important civilization has. Guilliman is trying to fix it. The Indomitus Crusade, the century-long military effort to push the Chaos forces back from the worlds most threatened by the Great Rift's emergence, was partly about military necessity and partly about establishing Guilliman's authority as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, demonstrating to every faction within the Imperium that the returning Primarch was capable and willing, and not interested in being managed by the existing power structures. The Primaris Space Marines that Call created, who are the other major strategic asset of the current era, are Guilliman's answer to the question of how you field a military force that has the genetic stability and the tactical flexibility that the current threat environment demands. The Lion is working on something else. What exactly, the Dark Imperium narrative has not fully revealed. He moves through the worst affected regions of the galaxy's chaos-tainted half, gathering information, destroying threats, rebuilding trust with Dark Angel's forces, who were not entirely certain how to respond to their returned Primarch. He is building towards something, with the specific patience of someone who spent 10 years alone in the forests of Caliban as a child, and learned then that patience was not a virtue, but a survival strategy. Russ. The Space Wolves' faith in the Wolftime prophecy has been sustained for 10,000 years by Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who was there. The Wolftime is described as the final battle, the great conflict at the end of history. Whether this is literal eschatological prophecy, metaphor for a very large upcoming engagement, or something else entirely, is not clear from the available lore. What is clear is that the Space Wolves believe Russ will return, and that the return will be meaningful in a way that transcends ordinary military reinforcement. Whether the 41st millennium is close enough to whatever the Wolftime describes to bring him back is one of the most eagerly anticipated story developments in the current Games Workshop narrative. And, on the other side, Angron, banished from Armageddon but not destroyed, returns to real space repeatedly. Each manifestation seems more stable than the last, as though Khorne's investment in maintaining his presence in the material universe is growing along with the Warp's own increasing presence following the Great Rift. The Model Games Workshop, released for the 10th edition of the tabletop game, is enormous and devastating, which is a statement about where the current narrative places him on the scale of individual entity threats. Mortarion fought the Plague Wars in Ultramar, demonstrating that the returned Guilliman and the Daemon Primarch of Nurgle were capable of genuine conflict that could damage both sides. The result was Mortarion's eventual withdrawal rather than defeat. He was pushed back, but not destroyed, a distinction that matters enormously when discussing beings of this caliber. He withdrew. He will be back. Magnus made his significant move against Fenris, an assault on the Space Wolves' homeworld and fortress, the Battle of the Fang reimagined at a larger scale, an attack that came close to destroying the chapter before it was repelled. The damage inflicted was severe, and the Space Wolves are still recovering, both in terms of warrior numbers and in terms of the specific psychological wound of having their home threatened at that level. Fulgrim's reappearance is recent enough in the narrative timeline that it is still being developed. The Phoenician, 10,000 years into his Slaneshi demon prince existence, is going to be something that requires careful thought about what exactly he has become and what his goals are in a galaxy that has changed enormously from the one he last engaged with directly. The pattern of the current era is the pattern the entire Warhammer 40K narrative has always had, expressed at the highest possible scale. The most powerful beings in the setting are engaged in a conflict that will determine the fate of the most important civilization in the galaxy, and neither side is guaranteed to win, and the lore is honest about this in ways that more optimistic settings are not. The Primarchs might save humanity, or the Daemon Primarchs might overwhelm the Loyalists, and something genuinely terrible might be the outcome. This is Warhammer 40K. Both are possible. The darkness is not just aesthetic. It is structural. What the returning Loyalist Primarchs represent, beyond their individual combat capabilities, is the possibility that the trajectory is not locked. That 10,000 years of decline can be reversed. That the beings the Emperor made at his most capable might be sufficient to hold what he built, even in its most compromised form. Guillemot believes this. The Lion's secrecy and patience suggest he believes something similar. And Russ, wherever he is, presumably went into the Eye of Terror because he believed there was something worth doing there. Not just that he could fight, but that fighting the right things in the right place might matter. That belief that extraordinary strength can be applied usefully, that power at this scale is not inevitably corrupting, that the thing made to be a weapon can also be something more, that is the argument the Loyalist Primarchs embody. And the Horus Heresy and its aftermath are the counter-argument. The setting does not resolve this tension. It holds both, because both are true, and the truth is complicated. Final closing. The answer, complete. Section 22. The Primarch Aura and its practical battlefield effects. Every Primarch who has ever stood on a battlefield changed that battlefield, not just through their personal combat capability, but through something more diffuse and more profound, the aura they carried with them. The psychic and emotional radiation that emanated from their existence and reshaped the behavior of every being within range. This is not metaphor. The lore is consistent and specific about this effect. Space Marines whose Primarch was present on the field fought differently, not just better in some vague motivational sense, but qualitatively differently, in ways that exceeded what their training and their individual capability could account for. The gene bond between Primarch and genetic sons created a channel through which the Primarch's emotional state could be transmitted directly, and what the sons felt in that transmission was not simply encouragement. It was the emotional experience of their father, a being whose emotional states operated at a scale and intensity that made ordinary human feeling seem like starlight compared to the sun. When Sanguinius was composed in battle, calm, precise, every movement elegant and deliberate, his blood angels found clarity they did not normally possess. When he was grieving, they carried a weight that went beyond their own concerns. When he was furious, the fury reached through the gene bond and added itself to their own, amplifying in the specific way that psychic transmission through a biological channel can amplify, until the emotion in each warrior exceeded what any single human heart should be capable of holding. The Siege of Terra passages in the Black Library novels describe this in detail. The Blood Angels holding the outer walls experienced their father's presence as something that reached below conscious, thought they fought past wounds that should have stopped them, held positions past the point where rational calculation said holding was impossible, made decisions in the heat of close combat that were better than their training would normally produce, because something in them was running on a frequency tuned to a being of extraordinary capability, and that frequency was carrying instructions that their bodies knew how to follow, even when their minds were too battered to form coherent plans. The flip side of this is equally documented. When a Primarch was afraid, which was rare, but happened, their sons felt it. When a Primarch doubted, the doubt could leak into the Legion. This is part of why the Primarchs' psychological health mattered militarily as well as personally. A Primarch experiencing what amounts to depression or crisis, or the specific kind of existential despair that beings who have lived through the loss of everything they built sometimes experience, could transmit some of that state to thousands of warriors. The emotional contagion ran both directions. The Thousand Sons experience during the burning of Prospero is the most extreme negative example. Magnus, watching his city burn, watching his sons die around him, finally taking the field in a state of grief and fury, and the specific anguish of someone who has made a terrible mistake and is watching the consequences unfold. His sons felt all of that. They fought not just against the space wolves, but against the weight of their own father's despair. Some of the accounts of Thousand Sons warriors during the final stages of Prospero's defense describe them fighting with a kind of wild, desperate energy that was partly theirs and partly not theirs, borrowed or transmitted from Magnus himself. After the heresy, and during the current era, this aura effect has become both more significant and more complicated for the Daemon Primarchs. Angron's presence doesn't just inspire his World Eaters to fight harder. It creates a kind of psychic resonance with Khorne's domain that makes the blood that is spilled in his vicinity more empowering to the blood god than blood spilled anywhere else, which in turn draws more demonic attention to the area and creates feedback loops that make his battles escalate in scale almost automatically. His aura is not just personal power, it is an attractor for divine violence. Mortarian's presence spreads his patron's gifts through the environment. The air becomes toxic. The ground begins to transform. Nurgle's creative destructive energy flows outward from the Daemon Primarch and affects the landscape, the atmosphere, and the biology of everything nearby in ways that are independent of whether Mortarion is actively doing anything. He is simply present, and his presence is enough to begin a transformation that, given sufficient time, will convert an ordinary battlefield into something that looks like the Death Guard's home territory in the Eye of Terror. Magnus's presence in real space is a destabilizing event. The local warp becomes turbulent. Psychic phenomena increase in frequency and intensity around him. His Thousand Sons fight better because their psychic gifts are amplified by proximity to the most powerful psyker alive. His opponents find their own psychic users affected, sometimes overwhelmed by the psychic pressure in the area, sometimes driven to uncharacteristic decisions or perceptions, as the turbulence in the local warp bleeds through into their consciousness. The loyalist Primarchs in the current era carry their own versions of this. Guillemin's presence anchors reality in a small way around him. The Emperor's sword burns with divine fire that is inimical to chaos, corruption, and that fire creates an area of effect that makes the warp slightly less hospitable to demonic influence in its immediate vicinity. This is minor on a galactic scale. On a battlefield, it can be the difference between holding and losing. The Lion's presence, since his return, has been described as having a quality of resolve that transmits to the warriors around him, a kind of gravitational certainty that refuses to acknowledge the possibility of retreat. Russ's presence, when he was active, was specifically noted as intensifying whatever physical conflict was happening around him, not the psychic projection quality that the Psyker Primarchs exhibited. Something more instinctual, more territorial, the aura of a predator in their element that reached into the animal-level threat response of everyone nearby and told them this was real, this was now, everything else was irrelevant. The aura of a Primarch is part of their combat power, and it is part of their power even when they are not fighting. The beings who surround them perform differently, behave differently, feel differently, because the Primarch's warp presence extends outward and touches everyone in range. 10,000 years after their deaths or disappearances, that touch continues through the gene seed weaker, imperfect, a genetic echo rather than a direct transmission, but still real, still shaping Space Marines who will never meet the beings whose blood they carry. Section 23. The weapons that can harm a Primarch and what that tells us. Given everything we have established about Primarch durability, the obvious question becomes, what actually works on them? What can kill or meaningfully harm beings who survive punctured hearts and fractured spines and orbital nuclear bombardments? The answer is specific and informative about the nature of their power. Other Primarchs, first and most obviously, a Primarch fighting another Primarch is fighting something that can match their biology, their strength, their resistance to damage, and their will. Ferrus died at Fulgrim's hands. Sanguinius died at Horus's hands. Alfarius died at Dorn's hands. Russ came very close to finishing Magnus at Prospero. The most reliable way to end a Primarch is another Primarch, ideally with some kind of specific advantage, a daemonic weapon, a power imbalance, a moment of psychological vulnerability. Weapons crafted with anti-daemonic or anti-warp properties, particularly those carrying divine power from the Emperor himself, represent the other category of reliably effective tools against the Daemon Primarchs. The Emperor's sword that Guilliman currently carries demonstrates this. It can cause observable damage to beings and environments that exist primarily in the warp, which conventional weapons cannot do. A bloodthirster's hide that shrugs off bolter fire will not shrug off the Emperor's sword. The Sisters of Silence, whose psychic blankness creates a zone of null warp around them, are specifically effective support against psychic Primarchs and daemon Primarchs, whose powers rely on warp connection. During the burning of Prospero, the Sisters' presence was one of the key factors in neutralizing Magnus's ability to overwhelm his attackers. Psychically, their nullifying effect limited the range and effectiveness of his sorcery in a way that no conventional weapon could have achieved. Against a daemon Primarch, like Magnus or Mortarion, a force that includes Sisters of Silence forces has significant advantages that a purely martial force lacks. Grey Knights, whose specific design incorporates anti-demonic properties at every level of their biology and equipment, represent a specialized counter to daemon-type entities, including daemon Primarchs. Their collective banishment of Angron at the First War for Armageddon cost them tremendously, but was achieved not through physically overwhelming him, but through the specific tools they carried, being the correct tools for the task. They couldn't have done it without the right instruments. But with those instruments, they succeeded against an entity that regular Space Marine forces were simply dying to. The psychological dimension is also a genuine vulnerability, which sounds strange for beings of this magnitude, but the lore supports it. Curze's eventual death was his own choice, a deliberate decision not to resist an assassin. He could have killed M'Shen. He allowed himself to be killed instead. The psychological damage that had been done to him by a lifetime of seeing terrible futures without being able to prevent them, by being used as a tool and then condemned for how he was used, had reached a point where his will to continue had simply run out. No physical weapon ended Curze. His own exhaustion did. The butcher's nails that were killing Angron before his ascension represent the other end of this, a purely mechanical vulnerability. The implants were hardware hammered into a biological system, and they were degrading that system continuously. The power they gave him was inseparable from the damage they did, and eventually, the damage would have exceeded the power. Lorgar's ritual of demonic ascension saved him from this, but in doing so also removed the last remnants of the Angron, who had loved his gladiator companions and mourned them in the years after their deaths. The perpetual quality specifically affects how vulnerability applies to Vulkan. He can be killed. He has been killed many times, but he cannot be permanently killed by any means that destroys only his physical body. Whatever ultimately ended Vulkan's ability to regenerate the lore suggests he eventually departed from the setting voluntarily rather than being destroyed. It was not the accumulation of physical damage. It was a choice or a condition related to his soul and his identity rather than his biology. These vulnerabilities are not weaknesses in the pejorative sense. They are the specific contours of these beings' mortality, the places where even extraordinary power meets something it cannot simply overcome by being more powerful. Understanding them is understanding the limits that make the Primarchs interesting as characters rather than as abstract forces. Without limits, there is no story. The limits are part of what they are. Final closing. So, how strong are the Primarchs in Warhammer 40K? Strong enough to break each other's spines and shrug off orbital bombardment. Strong enough to kill greater daemons with their hands and hold defensive lines that armies couldn't hold. Strong enough to think in ways no human mind can follow. To feel the deaths of their sons as physical pain across stellar distances. To leave marks on history that are still legible 10,000 years later. Not strong enough to be immune to grief, to betrayal, to the specific vulnerabilities built into them by the worlds they grew up on and the choices they made. Not strong enough to survive each other when the conditions were wrong. Not strong enough to hold together under pressures that had nothing to do with physical force. The physical answer is extraordinary beyond comfortable reference points. The psychic answer is from battlefield influence to reality-tearing force. The historical answer is enough to shape the fate of humanity across 10 millennia. The honest answer is stronger than description handles well, and weaker than they needed to be against the one thing that actually threatened them, which was each other. Thank you for spending this time in the deep lore. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Tell me who your Primarch is, and subscribe if you haven't already. There is more like this coming. For the Emperor, for Sanguinius, for the Wolf Time.